The city is quiet now, but it does not feel empty. Wind moves through broken walls where voices once rose in markets, courtyards, workshops, temples and narrow streets packed with dust and heat. A doorway still opens into a room where someone once stored grain. A stone step is worn smooth by feet that crossed it for generations. In the distance, a palace platform stands above the plain, not as a symbol of command anymore, but as a raised scar in the landscape. Whatever happened here did not happen in a single instant. The people did not simply vanish like smoke. They cooked, argued, carried water, feared the future, buried their dead, repaired their homes, and watched the signs gather around them until the old world no longer held together. This is the strange truth behind the collapse of ancient civilizations. Ruins often make the ending look sudden. A burned palace, an abandoned city gate, a smashed statue, a clay tablet left unfinished in a room of ash. These things seem to tell a story of catastrophe. They invite the mind to imagine one terrible night when everything ended. Yet collapse is usually slower, more complicated and more human than that. It is a season of failing harvests, unpaid soldiers, broken alliances, anxious priests, desperate rulers, families leaving quietly before dawn, merchants no longer arriving from the coast canals, silting up taxes, rising trust thinning, and old explanations losing their power. The final fire may be dramatic, but the civilization has often been weakening long before the flames appear. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of ancient collapse is not only about the past, it is about the hidden machinery beneath every society that seems permanent while it is working and fragile only after it breaks. Across the ancient world, collapse left many different kinds of silence. In Mesopotamia, cities that once controlled irrigation trade and temple economies fell into ruin as dynasties rose and disappeared. In Egypt, periods of royal power gave way to fragmentation, famine, and regional rule, even though the Nile itself kept flowing. In the Indus Valley, great urban centres with carefully planned streets and drainage systems gradually emptied or transformed, leaving behind no clear royal monuments to explain their decline. In the Eastern Mediterranean palace, kingdoms that traded copper, tin, ivory, glass, grain, and luxury goods across a glittering Bronze Age network were destroyed, abandoned, or reduced within a few generations. In the Maya lowlands, carved monuments stopped appearing in many cities, royal courts lost power, and dense urban landscapes gave way to smaller communities, migration and forest returning over plazas once filled with ceremony. The word collapse can be misleading because it sounds total. It suggests a building dropping into dust, a people erased, a culture ending forever. But ancient collapse is rarely the disappearance of everyone. More often it's the breakdown of a particular way of organizing life. Kings lose authority, central governments weaken, trade routes fail, cities shrink, monument building stops. Writing may become rare. Skilled crafts may decline or move elsewhere. People survive, but they survive differently. A palace economy can collapse while villages continue. A royal dynasty can fall while language, memory, farming, religion, and local identity carry on. What dies is not always the people. Often what dies is the system that once bound them together. That distinction matters because ruins can deceive the eye. A city abandoned by its ruling class may look like a dead civilization from above, but on the ground families may have moved only a short distance away. A burned archive may look like an ending, but the farmers who supplied the palace may have adjusted to new loyalties or smaller political worlds. A temple no longer receiving offerings may stand silent, while the gods once worshipped that continue under new names in new places or inside households too modest to leave grand remains. Archaeology often preserves the hard bones of power better than the soft tissue of everyday survival. Stone platforms, palaces' walls, tombs, and inscriptions remain visible. The lives that adapted after collapse are harder to see. Still the remains speak. They speak in layers of ash pollen trapped in lake mud bones marked by malnutrition, abandoned fields, clogged canals, broken trade patterns, imported goods that suddenly stop appearing, fortifications hastily built, mass graves, shipwrecks, drought signals in cave formations, and written complaints from people who did not yet know they were living through history. These clues rarely point to a single cause. No single explanation fully accounts for most ancient collapses. Climate stress can weaken a kingdom, but drought alone does not explain why some societies endure while others fracture. Invasion can destroy a city, but attackers often arrive when a state is already strained. Disease can empty households and armies, but its traces may be difficult to identify. Bad rulers can make disasters worse, but even wise leaders may be trapped inside systems too complex to control. This is why the collapse of ancient civilizations remains so compelling. It sits between evidence and uncertainty. Scholars can measure rainfall patterns from mineral deposits, reconstruct diets from bones, trace trade through pottery and metal, read desperate letters on clay tablets, and map abandoned settlements across entire regions. Yet the final human experience is always partly out of reach. What did it feel like when merchants stopped coming, when a granary failed, when a ruler claimed divine favor, but the drought continued? When a family decided that the city of their ancestors was no longer safe, the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the records suggests collapse was not a clean historical event. It was lived as confusion. For many ancient people, civilization must have seemed like the natural order of the world. The city had always stood there. The temple had always received offerings. The king's name had always been carved into stone or stamped into clay. The canals had always brought water. The caravans had always come. Children grew up inside systems that felt old, stable, and sacred. Yet every civilization is made of moving parts. It depends on harvests arriving at the right time, officials remaining loyal workers, accepting burdens, soldiers being fed rivers behaving within tolerable limits, neighbors honoring agreements, trade routes staying open, and shared beliefs continuing to feel believable. When enough of these parts fail together, the old permanence becomes an illusion. One of the most surprising lessons of ancient collapse is that success can create danger. The same systems that allow a civilization to grow can make it vulnerable. Irrigation feeds cities, but it can also lead to salinized soil, political conflict over water, and dependence on constant maintenance. Long-distance trade brings wealth, but it can also make local economies dependent on distant mines, ports, and partners. Powerful kings can organize labor and defense, but centralized authority can become brittle if legitimacy fails. Large cities produce specialization, culture, and monumental architecture, but they also require enormous flows of food, fuel, water, and trust. Complexity solves problems, but it creates new problems that are harder to see until stress arrives. A village can survive a bad year by tightening belts, shifting crops, moving herds, or relying on kin. A great city cannot easily improvise when thousands depend on grain deliveries, administrative record storage systems, and political order. A palace cannot maintain bronze weapons if tin no longer reaches its workshops. A dynasty cannot project divine control when fields crack, children starve, and rival leaders promise protection closer to home. Civilizations often collapse not because they are simple and weak, but because they are complex and strong in ways that require constant success. The ancient world offers many versions of this pattern. The Akkadian Empire, often remembered as one of the first great territorial empires in Mesopotamia, expanded across diverse landscapes and peoples. Later evidence suggests that severe aridity may have contributed to its weakening, though scholars still debate exactly how climate and politics interacted. Egypt's Old Kingdom built pyramids that still dominate the imagination, yet after centuries of centralized royal power, the country entered a period of fragmentation with climate stress, low Nile floods, administrative strain, and regional ambition, all playing possible roles. The Indus cities show signs of gradual transformation rather than fiery destruction, with shifts in river systems, trade settlement patterns, and perhaps climate altering the foundations of urban life. The Bronze Age palace world collapsed through a storm of pressures so tangled that the debate continues. Drought warfare, migration, rebellion, earthquakes, economic fragility, and the breakdown of international trade all appear in the shadows. The Maya case is equally complex because many cities declined while Maya people continued, adapted, and preserved their identities into the present. Even when a famous collapse has a clear symbol, the symbol is not the whole explanation. A burned palace is not the beginning of a collapse, it may be the final visible wound. A ruined gate does not tell us how long fear had been growing outside the walls. A royal tomb robbed in antiquity does not reveal how many workers had stopped believing the old order deserved protection. A tablet recording grain shortages does not show the faces of those who waited in line. Archaeology gives fragments, and the historian must resist the temptation to make them simpler than they are. There is also a moral temptation in collapse stories. Later societies often explain ancient failures as punishment for decadence, weakness, arrogance, or moral decay. Sometimes ancient writers did the same. They blamed impious kings, luxury foreigners, corrupt officials, or angry gods. Modern observers can fall into similar patterns, replacing gods with environmental mismanagement or political incompetence. These factors can matter sometimes greatly. But collapse is rarely a neat lesson with one villain. It is usually a convergence. A drought becomes political when food distribution fails. A migration becomes violent when border societies are already unstable. A disease becomes transformative when it strikes armies, farmers, and administrators at once. Inequality becomes dangerous when people no longer believe sacrifice is shared. Belief becomes fragile when the world no longer matches the promises made by those in power. The most haunting part is that collapse often looks survivable until it is not. One failed harvest can be endured. One lost battle can be avenged. One bad ruler can be replaced. One trade interruption can be rooted around. But when stresses overlap, they begin to change the meaning of each other. Drought reduces surplus, which weakens taxation, which limits military response, which emboldens rivals, which disrupts trade, which reduces elite wealth, which intensifies internal conflict, which undermines legitimacy, which makes coordinated repair harder. The chain does not need every link to break. It only needs enough links to fail close together. In the ruins, this complexity becomes strangely quiet. The stones do not explain themselves. The silence does not say whether people left in panic or in resignation. It does not tell us whether a final priest locked the temple door, whether a scribe understood the old system was ending, or whether a child walking away from the city believed the family might return after the next rains. But the silence is not empty. It is full of warnings, not simple warnings about one cause, but deeper ones about dependence, memory, adaptation, and the danger of believing that a world built by human hands cannot come apart. The first step into the mystery is to look not at the moment of collapse but at what existed before it. The rising order, the confidence, the farms, rivers, roads, rituals, storehouses, and ambitions that made ancient civilization possible. Every fallen city was once a solution. Every ruined palace was once an answer to a problem. Before the cracks widened, these societies created abundance, beauty, power, and meaning on a scale earlier humans could scarcely have imagined. To understand why they fell, the story has to begin with why they rose. Civilization begins with a bargain so old that no one living inside it can remember making it. People give up some freedom of movement, some simplicity, some direct control over their own food, and in return they receive something powerful: storage, protection, specialization, memory, and scale. A small band can follow animals, gather wild plants, move away from danger, and carry its world on its back. A farming village cannot move so easily, but it can grow a field, fill a granary, raise children in one place, build walls, bury ancestors beneath familiar ground, and turn a landscape into inheritance. Out of that exchange comes the first deep root of civilization, not a palace, not a king, not a monument, but the decision to stay. That decision is never simple. Farming does not instantly make life easier. In many places, early agricultural communities work harder than mobile foragers, eat narrower diets, and become more exposed to famine when crops fail. Bones from early farming populations often show stress disease and heavy labour, yet agriculture offers something that hunting and gathering rarely produce. In the same way, surplus that can be stored, counted, guarded, redistributed, taxed, stolen, promised, and turned into power. Grain is especially important because it waits. Wheat, barley, millet, and rice can be dried and kept. They can be measured in baskets or jars. They can be collected by chiefs' temples or states. A field of grain is food, but a granary of grain is administration waiting to be born. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, and China, water and soil create possibilities that are too large for one household to manage alone. Floodplains can be generous, but they demand timing and cooperation. Channels must be dug, dikes must be repaired, silt must be managed, boundaries must be remembered. Someone has to decide who receives water first, who maintains the canal, who stores the harvest, and who settles disputes when one field drinks too much while another dries. What begins as practical coordination can become hierarchy. The official who counts grain becomes necessary. The storehouse becomes sacred. The leader who organizes labor becomes harder to challenge. The ritual specialist who blesses the flood, the rain, or the harvest stands close to the center of survival. This is one reason the earliest civilizations often rise around rivers, though the river alone does not create them. The Nile brings a rhythm that ancient Egyptians turn into a vision of cosmic order. The Tigris and Euphrates are less predictable, and Mesopotamian city-states develop amid a harsher tension between abundance and threat. The Indus cities emerge across a vast region of seasonal rivers, floodplains, trade routes, and carefully planned urban spaces. Along the Yellow River and other Chinese river systems, farming communities grow within landscapes where flood-loose soil, millet, rice, and political organization gradually intertwine. The water matters, but what matters even more is what human beings build around it. Calendars, myths, labor systems, measurements, ownership, authority, and memory. Writing appears in this world not first as poetry but as accounting. The earliest marks are often concerned with goods, quantities, deliveries, workers, offerings, animals, and obligations. It is easy to romanticize writing as the birth of literature, and in time it becomes exactly that. But in the beginning it is also a technology of control. It allows power to extend beyond the human voice. A spoken order disappears unless remembered. A written record can sit in an archive and speak later. It can prove that grain was owed, land was granted, labour was assigned, or taxes were paid. It can preserve a ruler's name beyond death. It can turn memory into an institution. Yet writing also reveals a lesser-known truth about early civilization. Much of it is built on invisible labour. The monuments survive, but the people who haul stone, bake bricks, clear fields, repair roads, weave cloth, carry water, shape pottery, grind grain, and raise animals are the real foundation. A pyramid, a ziggurat, a palace, or a ceremonial plaza is never just architecture. It is a sign that thousands of daily tasks have been organized in one direction. Food has to reach workers, tools have to be made, orders have to be transmitted. Specialists have to be supported by farmers who produce more than their own households consume. The monument is the visible peak of a much larger social mountain. Religion helps make that mountain stable. In early states, the sacred and the political are rarely separate in the modern sense. Kings rule with divine favour, temples hold land, priests manage offerings, rituals mark the agricultural year, and the order of society is often described as a reflection of cosmic order. This does not mean people are naive or blindly obedient. It means authority is strongest when it feels woven into the structure of reality. If the flood comes, if the sun rises, if the fields produce, if the king performs the proper rites, and enemies stay away, the system appears confirmed by the world itself. Belief becomes a form of infrastructure. It helps people accept labour, taxation, hierarchy, and sacrifice because these burdens are placed inside a larger story. Trade stretches that story outward. No ancient civilization is truly alone. Even societies that seem geographically contained depend on exchange networks for stone metal, shells, timber pigments, luxury goods, ideas, animals, and sometimes people. Bronze, the metal that gives an entire age its name, requires copper and tin is not conveniently available everywhere. Lapis lazuli travels from distant mountains into royal and sacred contexts far away. Obsidian amber, incense, cedar, ivory glass, and textiles move across deserts, seas, rivers, and mountain passes. A necklace in a tomb may be a map of connections. A foreign seal in a port city may be evidence of trust between strangers. A shipwreck can reveal an economy more international than many people imagine when they think of the ancient world. This connectedness brings energy. It allows cities to grow beyond their local resources. It gives elites rare goods that support status. It spreads technologies and symbols. It encourages diplomacy, marriage alliances, treaties, and shared artistic styles. But it also creates dependency, and dependency is one of civilization's quiet vulnerabilities. A palace that needs imported tin for weapons, imported timber for ships, imported grain during shortages and distant markets for prestige goods, is strong only as long as the routes remain open. Trade turns local societies into parts of larger systems, and when those systems tremble, the shock travels. What looks like prosperity can also be exposure. Political authority develops in many forms, but it usually claims to solve the same basic problems: defense order, storage, distribution, irrigation, justice, and meaning. A ruler is not simply someone who commands. A ruler is expected to make the world predictable. Ancient kings boast of feeding people, defeating enemies, building temples, digging canals, restoring order, protecting widows and orphans, and pleasing the gods. Whether those boasts match reality is another matter. Royal inscriptions are not neutral documents. They are crafted to project power. Still, they reveal what rulers want people to believe about them. The king is valuable because he stands between the community and chaos. The trouble is that chaos is never defeated. It is only managed for a while. Floods return, droughts return, insects disease, invasion, rebellion, and succession crises return. Every system of authority is judged by its ability to respond to recurring danger. In good times, the palace seems like the source of order. In bad times, it can begin to look like a burden. Taxes that were tolerable during abundance become unbearable during scarcity. Labour duties that once built canals become resented when officials are corrupt or ineffective. The ruler's claim to cosmic favour becomes dangerous when the sky does not cooperate. The same institutions that unify a society can become targets of anger when the bargain appears broken. Still, for long stretches the bargain works. It works well enough to produce cities that astonish even in ruin. Mud brick walls rise above Mesopotamian plains. Egyptian builders align stone with extraordinary precision. Indus planners lay out streets and drainage with a discipline that suggests strong civic organization, even if their political structure remains uncertain. Minoan palaces on Crete organize storage ceremony, craft production, and maritime exchange. Maya kings commission temples and carved monuments that bind dynastic history to cosmic cycles. In the Andes, communities build terraces, roads, and highland systems of labour and exchange long before later empires expand them. Civilization is not one invention made once. It is a pattern discovered repeatedly in different landscapes with different crops, gods, technologies, and social rules. What ties these worlds together is not sameness, but complexity. People become linked through obligations they cannot personally see. A farmer may never meet the soldier who eats grain collected from his field. A potter may never meet the merchant who carries her vessel downriver. A temple servant may never know the miners who provided the copper for a ritual object. A scribe may record sheep oil and barley for officials who rely on systems already too large for any single mind to fully understand. Civilization creates distance between cause and effect. That distance allows scale, but it also hides danger. When something fails far away, the consequences may arrive late, disguised as shortage rumour, price unrest, or fear. The evidence for these early worlds remains uneven. Some civilizations leave thousands of texts, while others leave undeciphered signs or no readable writing at all. Some rulers carved their victories in stone, while ordinary people left only bones, tools, hearths, and floors. Some cities were burned and preserved by disaster. Others eroded slowly their mud brick, returning almost invisibly to the earth. Scholars still debate the political nature of the Indus civilization, the precise relationship between temple and palace in early Mesopotamia, the role of migration versus local development in many regions, and the degree to which climate shaped early state formation. The record is rich, but never complete. Ancient civilization has to be reconstructed from fragments, and the gaps are part of the story. One surprising detail is that many early cities are not as permanently stable as their ruins make them seem. Populations shift, neighborhoods are rebuilt, centers rise, shrink, move, and rise again. Some communities experiment with urban life and then step back from it. Others maintain large settlements without obvious kings or extravagant royal tombs. The path toward civilization is not a straight road from village to city to empire. It is full of reversals, alternatives, failed experiments, and local choices. Human beings do not simply march toward complexity, because complexity is destiny. They adopt it when it solves problems, tolerate it when it brings benefits, resist it when it becomes oppressive, and abandon it when its costs outweigh its promises. This matters because collapse is already hidden inside the rise. The first storehouses create surplus but also inequality and temptation. The first walls create security but also boundaries and fear. The first kings create coordination but also dependence on leadership. The first irrigation systems create abundance but also maintenance burdens and environmental risk. The first trade networks create wealth but also vulnerability to distant disruption. The first sacred states create meaning, but also the possibility of spiritual crisis when events turn against them. Civilization is not fragile because it is poorly built. It is fragile because it concentrates life into systems that must keep functioning, and yet it would be wrong to see ancient civilization only as a trap. These societies produce art, law, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, literature, engineering, ritual, and memory. They preserve harvests against bad seasons. They allow craft specialists to master skills over generations. They create places where strangers can cooperate under shared rules. They build calendars from the sky roads across difficult terrain ships that cross open water and stories that outlive the voices that first told them. The same complexity that makes collapse possible also makes civilization extraordinary. So the rise of civilization is not a simple triumph and not a simple mistake. It is a human answer to uncertainty. It is an attempt to make food last longer, power reach farther, memory endure danger, become manageable, and death less final through monuments and names. But every answer becomes a new question. Once people depend on grain, what happens when the rain fails? Once they depend on kings, what happens when kings cannot protect them? Once they depend on trade, what happens when roads close and ships stop arriving? Once they believe the world is ordered, what happens when the world begins to behave as if it is not? The ruins wait at the far end of those questions. But before the fires, before the abandoned plazas, before the last inscriptions, there is the machine of civilization in motion, fields, ripening under the sun, boats, moving along rivers, scribes pressing marks into clay, priests watching the sky, soldiers guarding gates, children learning the shape of streets they assume will always be there. The system looks solid because every part supports another. That is its genius. It is also the beginning of its danger. The fragile engine of an ancient civilization rarely announces itself as fragile. From the outside it looks confident. A city wall catches the morning light. Smoke lifts from thousands of hearths. Farmers move beyond the gates toward fields that have been worked for generations. Donkeys, carts, boats, and porters carry goods through a rhythm that seems almost natural. Officials sit with tablets, seals, weights, cords, jars, baskets, and lists. Temples receive offerings. Workshops shape metal, stone, wood, leather, and clay. Somewhere near the center, power gathers in rooms most people never enter, where rulers, priests, scribes, generals, and elite families make decisions that ripple outward into the lives of everyone else. The whole thing seems permanent because it moves every day, but permanence is often just repetition mistaken for destiny. A civilization survives by repeating certain acts so reliably that people stop noticing how much effort they require. Grain must be sown, watered, harvested, transported, measured, stored, protected, and redistributed. Canals must be cleared before they fail, not after. Roads must remain safe enough for merchants to risk the journey. Soldiers must believe they will be paid. Workers must believe their labor has meaning, or at least that refusing it would be more dangerous than obeying. Priests must maintain the rituals that make the system feel anchored in the unseen. Rulers must look strong even when their knowledge is limited, because doubt at the top can spread faster than any invading army. The engine runs on food first. Everything else depends on the harvest. Palaces, temples, armies, workshops, and trade all draw their breath from fields. In a small village, food is visible. People know which family has grain, which field did well, which neighbour is hungry, and which storage jar is nearly empty. In a state, food becomes abstract. It moves through officials' quotas, taxation, tribute rations, and accounts. A worker receives grain because a scribe recorded an obligation. A soldier eats because a storehouse was filled months earlier by farmers he may never meet. A temple feast takes place because offerings pass through many hands. This distance allows large systems to function, but it also creates blindness. A shortage may be hidden for a time by records, promises, and redistribution, until suddenly the numbers no longer match the hunger. Water is the next unseen ruler. In river civilizations, water can look like a gift, but it is also a discipline. Too little water brings famine. Too much destroys fields, homes, and stored grain. Water arriving at the wrong time can be almost as disastrous as water not arriving at all. Irrigation turns uncertainty into something humans can partly command but only partly. Channels silt up, banks erode. Upstream communities take more than expected. Officials delay repairs. Labour is diverted to monuments, war, or elite projects. Salts can gather in the soil when irrigation is poorly drained, quietly reducing yields year after year. By the time the danger becomes obvious, the landscape itself may have been changed. What survives in the record suggests that some ancient societies were not defeated by one failed season, but by the slow accumulation of stresses they could manage for decades until they could not. Labour holds the machine together, and labour is never just muscle. It is organisation, obligation, timing, and consent under pressure. Ancient states need farmers during harvest, but they also need them for canal work, wall repair, military service, road building, temple projects, and transport. The same body cannot be everywhere at once. A ruler who demands too much labour at the wrong time may weaken the very agricultural base that supports his rule. A project meant to display power can become a drain on the system if the people building it are pulled away from fields herds or local repairs. Monumental construction often impresses later observers, but it also raises a quiet question: how much surplus coercion, belief, and administrative skill were needed to make this possible? Ancient elites understand, at least instinctively, that power must be seen. A king hidden behind records and taxes is only an administrator. A king who builds, conquers, judges, sacrifices, appears in procession, and places his name on stone becomes part of the landscape of belief. Palaces and temples are not luxuries in the simple sense. They are political instruments. Their height decoration, restricted spaces, and ritual routes teach people where authority lives. A person entering a great courtyard or standing beneath a massive platform feels small, and that feeling is part of the design. The built environment tells the population that order is larger than the individual, yet visible power depends on invisible trust. People must believe that the center can protect them or punish them, feed them or organize relief, speak to the gods, or at least maintain the rituals that keep chaos at bay. Trust in ancient societies is not necessarily gentle or democratic. It can be mixed with fear, habit dependence, and sacred obligation. But it still matters. If farmers hide grain, if local leaders keep taxes for themselves, if soldiers shift loyalty to regional commanders, if priests lose credibility, if merchants avoid official routes, the central machine begins to grind. Collapse often begins not when institutions disappear, but when people quietly stop cooperating with them. This loss of cooperation is difficult to see archaeologically because refusal does not always leave a dramatic layer in the ground. A burned palace is obvious. A tax avoided by a village is not. A canal left unrepaired for one extra season may look like ordinary sediment centuries later. A family moving to a smaller settlement leaves fewer traces than a city destroyed by fire. This is one of the problems in understanding collapse. The most important changes may be behavioral long before they become visible. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how to identify the moment when strain becomes breakdown. Bureaucracy, one of civilization's greatest inventions, is also one of its strangest vulnerabilities. Records allow a state to see beyond the horizon. They tell officials how much land is planted, how many animals are owed, how many workers are assigned, how much grain is stored, which temples receive offerings, and which cities send tribute. But records can create the illusion of control. A tablet can say grain exists in a storehouse, but rats mold theft. Spoilage, corruption, or local desperation may tell another story. A census can count households, but it cannot easily measure loyalty. A tax list can demand the same quota as last year, even if the rains failed and the fields produced less. Once administration becomes rigid, it may continue acting as if the old world still exists after conditions have changed. There is a dry understatement buried in many ancient records. Officials often seem most confident when they are least prepared. The language of command survives better than the experience of panic. Rulers boast, administrators list, treaties promise, temples record offerings. But behind the formal surface, the world can be shifting. A letter asking for grain, a complaint about unpaid rations, a mention of enemies, a note about labourers fleeing a sudden increase in fortifications, or the disappearance of imported goods can reveal stress that official monuments ignore. Ancient collapse is often read through these small disturbances, not through grand explanations left conveniently behind. Armies are another part of the engine, and they are expensive even when they are not fighting. Soldiers require food, weapons, training animals, transport and command. Fortresses require maintenance. Border posts require supplies. Chariots, ships, armour and later cavalry or siege equipment all draw resources from the broader economy. Military power can defend a state, expand its wealth, and secure trade routes, but it can also consume the surplus it is meant to protect. A state facing drought, rebellion, or economic strain may need its army more than ever at the exact moment it can least afford to maintain it. If soldiers go unpaid, or are settled on land that burdens local communities, defense becomes another source of tension. The elites themselves can become a danger to the system they dominate. Powerful families compete for offices, land temple privileges, military commands and royal favour. In stable periods, competition may be controlled through ceremony, marriage, inheritance, law and patronage. In unstable periods it can turn destructive. Provincial governors act independently. Palace factions form. Royal succession becomes disputed. Temples protect their wealth. Generals gain personal loyalty from troops. Local strongmen present themselves as saviours when the centre falters. The civilization may still exist on a map, but authority is no longer flowing smoothly from the centre to the edges. It is pooling in rival hands. The common people are not passive in this process, even if the records often make them seem silent. They make choices within constraint. They flee, hide, bargain, resist, collaborate, migrate, change. Crops join raiding groups, attach themselves to new patrons, or retreat into smaller communities. A city can lose population not because everyone dies, but because enough households decide that the risks of staying outweigh the benefits. This kind of abandonment can be gradual. A neighbourhood thins, a market shrinks, workshops close, roofs collapse and are not rebuilt. Fields near the city go uncultivated. The centre still performs rituals, still issues. Orders still claims legitimacy, but the human density that once made it powerful has begun to drain away. One lesser-known detail in many collapses is how much maintenance matters. Civilizations are often remembered for construction, but survival depends on repair. A canal freshly dug is a triumph. A canal cleared every year for a century is a civilization. A wall built in a moment of danger is impressive. A wall inspected, patched, guarded and supplied is a system. Terraces, roads, reservoirs, harbours, drains, fields, storage buildings and bridges all require ongoing attention. Collapse can begin when societies still know how to build but can no longer maintain what already exists. The ruins later appear ancient and dignified, but in their final years they may have been shabby patched, leaking and increasingly difficult to keep alive. This is where complexity becomes almost tragic. Each part of the system depends on other parts functioning just well enough. Farmers depend on water and security. Soldiers depend on grain and loyalty. Officials depend on records and obedience. Priests depend on offerings and belief. Merchants depend on roads. Ports trust and demand. Rulers depend on all of them while pretending to stand above them. When conditions are favourable, this interdependence produces strength. It allows a society to mobilise resources across distances, survive local disasters, and create astonishing cultural achievements. When conditions turn hostile, interdependence can transmit failure. A bad harvest becomes a fiscal crisis. A fiscal crisis becomes military weakness. Military weakness becomes raids. Raids disrupt trade. Lost trade reduces elite wealth. Elite conflict weakens legitimacy. Legitimacy loss reduces cooperation. Reduced cooperation makes recovery harder. No single explanation fully accounts for this kind of unravelling because the causes feed one another. To say a civilization collapsed because of drought may be partly true, but drought must pass through society to become collapse. It passes through storage systems, inequality, political choices, religious expectations, labour demands, migration routes, and local resilience. To say invasion caused collapse may also be partly true, but invaders are more successful when borders are strained, armies underfunded, allies unreliable, and civilians desperate. To say bad leadership caused collapse may be true in some cases, but leaders act inside ecological and economic limits they may not understand. The fragile engine fails through interaction, and yet from within the city the signs may remain ambiguous for a long time. A low flood can be explained as temporary, a shortage can be blamed on corrupt officials, a rebellion can be dismissed as local disorder, a failed campaign can be followed by new propaganda. A ruler can build a monument precisely when the foundations of power are weakening because display becomes more urgent when reality is less secure. The surface of civilization may shine brightest when the internal strain is already severe. Later generations see the monument and imagine confidence. The people who built it may have felt fear. This is why collapse stories begin long before collapse. They begin with systems that require constant success and with societies that mistake managed uncertainty for control. Ancient civilizations rise because they learn to coordinate water, grain, labour, belief, trade and power. They fall when too many of those elements stop reinforcing one another. The engine does not need to explode. Sometimes it slows, overheats, jams and sheds pieces while everyone keeps trying to make it run. Across the ancient world, the first great tests often come from forces no ruler can command the sky, withholding rain, rivers shifting their moods, seasons arriving wrong and landscapes changing in ways that turn old knowledge unreliable. Human systems may be fragile, but they are never isolated from the earth beneath them. The next cracks often begin not in palace rooms, but in clouds that do not gather, fields that do not ripen, and wells that sink lower year after year. The first warning is not always a disaster. Sometimes it's only a season that feels wrong. The rain arrives late or not at all. A river that once rose with reassuring power comes thin and hesitant through its banks. Fields that should turn green remain dull and brittle. Herds are driven farther from settlements in search of pasture. Wells are deepened. Granaries are opened earlier than planned. At first, people explain it as hardship, not history. Every society knows bad years. A bad year does not destroy a kingdom. But when the bad years gather, when recovery never fully comes, before the next failure begins, the sky itself becomes a political force. Drought is one of the most powerful suspects in the collapse of ancient civilizations, but it must be understood carefully. Drought does not march into a city like an army. It does not burn a palace or smash a gate. It works through roots, animals, storage jars, wages, debts, taxes, rumours and hunger. Its violence is slow, and for that reason it can be underestimated. A kingdom may survive the first dry year by using stored grain. It may survive the second by raising taxes, reducing rations, buying food, moving herds, or taking from weaker neighbours. But each solution can damage the future. Stored grain disappears. Animals die or are slaughtered too early. Farmers eat seed grain. Poor households fall into debt. Officials become harsher. Local leaders hoard supplies. The state looks alive, but it is consuming its own reserves. In ancient Mesopotamia, where cities depend on irrigation, and fragile balances between river field and administration climate stress could strike with particular force. The Akkadian Empire, associated with the power of Sargon and his successors, created one of the earliest large territorial states in world history. Its reach extended over different peoples, cities and landscapes, binding them through military force administration, tribute and ideology. For a time, it must have seemed almost impossible that such a state could unravel. Yet around the late 3rd millennium, BCE Akkadian power weakened cities, changed populations, shifted, and later traditions remembered disorder. Some paleoclimate evidence points to a period of severe aridity in parts of the Near East around this time. Dust deposits, settlement changes, and environmental indicators have led many scholars to connect drought with the empire's decline, but the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how the climate event translated into political collapse. It is unlikely that drought alone simply destroyed Akkad. Empires are not fields, they are human systems. The drying conditions may have reduced harvests, pushed pastoral groups into conflict with settled communities, weakened tribute networks, strained loyalty among conquered cities, and made imperial authority harder to maintain across long distances. Later, Mesopotamian texts describe enemies' famine and divine anger, but those texts are not straightforward reporting. They are memory shaped by politics, theology, and literary tradition. What survives in the record suggests a convergence environmental stress meeting, imperial overreach, local resistance, and the limits of early administration. The story is similar in Egypt, though Egypt's relationship with water is different. The Nile usually gives ancient Egypt a stability that many neighbouring regions lack. Its annual inundation renews the field's deposits fertile silt and supports a centralized kingdom whose rulers present themselves as guardians of cosmic balance. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramid builders, produces some of the most enduring monuments ever made by human hands. These stones speak of authority, organization, and belief on a breathtaking scale. Yet after centuries of central power, Egypt enters the first intermediate period, a time of regional fragmentation, weakened royal authority, and social strain. Low Nile floods may have played an important role. If the inundation is too weak, fields produce less grain. If grain declines, the royal administration has less surplus to reward officials, support workers, maintain loyalty, and perform generosity. Inscriptions from later and regional sources speak of famine and distress, though they must be read cautiously, because ancient elites often used images of chaos to praise themselves as restorers of order. Still, climate records from surrounding regions suggest that aridity affected parts of northeastern Africa and Western Asia around this broad period. No single explanation fully accounts for the Old Kingdom's decline. Power may have become decentralized as provincial officials grew stronger. Long reigns and succession issues may have strained the court. Administrative burdens may have increased, but a series of poor Nile floods would have made every weakness more dangerous. There is a haunting contradiction in Egypt's case. The pyramids appear to prove that the Old Kingdom was unshakable. Their mass feels eternal, almost geological. Yet the very society that built them depended on a living river whose behaviour could not be commanded by stone. The monuments endured because limestone is patient. The political system did not endure in the same form because authority needed harvests, loyalty distribution, and belief renewed every year. A pyramid could survive a low flood. A state might not survive many. Far away in the Maya lowlands, drought becomes part of another famous and often misunderstood collapse. The classic Maya world is not a single empire but a landscape of competing cities, dynasties, alliances, rivalries, rituals and farmers living in environments that range from fertile zones to regions where surface water is seasonally scarce. Maya kings anchor their authority through warfare ceremonies, ancestor veneration, monument building and cosmic timekeeping. Cities rise with temples, plazas, reservoirs, causeways carved steely, and dense surrounding populations. Their achievements are immense: mathematics, astronomy, writing, architecture, art and political sophistication. Then between roughly the 8th and 10th centuries CE, in many southern lowland centres, monument erection declines. Royal courts weaken or disappear. Populations shift and some major cities are abandoned or greatly reduced. Paleoclimate evidence, including lake sediments and cave formations, indicates repeated droughts during parts of this period. In a region where water storage and seasonal rainfall matter deeply, prolonged drought would have placed enormous pressure on agriculture reservoirs and political authority. Yet again, drought is not the whole story. The Maya did not vanish. Maya people continued in other regions, and millions of Maya descendants live today. The collapse affected particular political systems and urban centres, not an entire people erased from the earth. The droughts of the Maya lowlands became devastating because they interacted with human choices. Large populations required reliable food and water. Elite competition drove monument building and warfare. Forest clearance, soil stress, and agricultural intensification may have reduced resilience in some areas. Kings who claimed ritual power over rain fertility and cosmic order faced a crisis of legitimacy when the rains failed again and again. Warfare may have increased as resources tightened, making recovery harder. Some cities endured longer than others, suggesting that local ecology, water management, political flexibility, and trade connections mattered. Scholars still debate the balance of causes, but the pattern is clear enough. Climate stress exposed the limits of a political and ecological system already under pressure. Drought also shadows the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age, though it is only one part of that larger storm. Around 1200 BCE, palace societies across parts of Greece, Anatolia, the Levant and beyond suffer destruction, abandonment or severe transformation. Written records from the period hint at food shortages, enemy movements, desperate appeals and unstable alliances. Climate evidence suggests episodes of aridity in the broader region, which may have contributed to crop failures and migration. But this world is so interconnected that environmental stress in one area could spread through trade diplomacy and conflict into others. A drought in one kingdom could become a grain shortage in another, a migration pressure in a third, and a military crisis in a fourth. What makes ancient drought especially dangerous is that it changes time. In normal years, the past is a guide. Farmers know when to sow, priests know when to pray, officials know when to collect, herders know where pasture may return, kings know how much grain to expect. But prolonged climate stress makes inherited knowledge less reliable. The old calendar becomes uncertain, the old fields disappoint, the old wells fail. A society built on repetition begins to lose confidence in its own memory. And when memory fails, authority trembles because ancient power often rests on the claim that the world can be kept in order by doing what has always been done. There is also a social cruelty to drought. It does not strike everyone equally. Elites may continue eating long after the poor have begun to starve. Temples and palaces may control stored grain while rural households run out. Officials may demand taxes based on traditional quotas even when harvests collapse. Merchants may profit from scarcity. Families with livestock may move. Families tied to land may be trapped. Debt can turn hunger into bondage. A drought that begins as an environmental event becomes a test of justice. If people believe suffering is shared, they may endure more. If they believe the powerful are protected while everyone else pays, scarcity becomes anger. Ancient texts sometimes preserve this anger indirectly. They speak of disorder, banditry, empty fields, servants leaving masters, the poor becoming desperate, or the reversal of proper hierarchy. These descriptions may be exaggerated, stylized, or written later, but they reveal what elites feared most, not merely hunger, but a world in which obedience no longer felt natural. When the harvest fails, the ruler must not only find food, he must preserve the idea that the system still deserves survival. The surprising thing is that drought can also create movement, creativity, and adaptation. People do not simply wait to die. They migrate toward rivers, coasts, highlands, springs, or more reliable rainfall zones. They change crops. They reduce herds or shift herding routes. They dig reservoirs, deepen wells, build terraces, alter trade, or attach themselves to new powers. Collapse in one place may mean growth somewhere else. A city's abandonment may be a region's reorganization. What appears from the palace as disaster may appear from a household as a hard but rational decision to leave. This is why the image of a vanished civilization can be misleading. When drought contributes to collapse, it often disperses people rather than eliminating them. The city empties, but the people carry skills, stories, seeds, rituals, and languages into new landscapes. Some become villagers. Some join other states. Some become migrants remembered by settled peoples as raiders or outsiders. Some return generations later under different political forms. The collapse of authority does not mean the collapse of human continuity. Still, the damage can be immense. Once a major center loses population, the maintenance systems around it weaken. Reservoirs fill with silt. Canals break. Roads become unsafe. Fields return to scrub. Administrative knowledge becomes less useful without the institutions that supported it. Skilled artisans lose patrons. Scribes lose archives. Temples lose offerings. A drought may end, but the society that existed before it may not return because the networks required to restore it have already unraveled. Rain falling on an abandoned city does not automatically revive it. The deeper lesson of ancient drought is not that climate mechanically destroys civilizations. Human beings are resilient and many societies survive severe environmental stress. The lesson is that climate presses on existing weaknesses. It reveals whether institutions can adapt, whether resources are fairly distributed, whether leaders are trusted, whether communities have alternatives, and whether complexity has become too rigid. A drought asks a civilization a question in the harshest possible language. Can the system change quickly enough to protect the people who keep it alive? Many ancient states could answer for a while. They opened granaries, shifted labor, appealed to gods, fought for resources, negotiated with neighbors, and tried to hold the center together. But when dry years multiplied, when rivers failed, when hunger met taxation, when belief met disappointment, and when local survival became more urgent than loyalty to distant rulers, the answer became less certain. The sky did not need to destroy the city directly. It only had to make the old bargain impossible to keep. And even drought is only one face of environmental change. Sometimes the problem is not the absence of water, but water in the wrong place, moving with a force no wall can resist, or disappearing from channels that once carried life. Rivers shift. Floods tear through settlements. Irrigation poisons the soil it once made fertile. Seas retreat, harbours silt, and landscapes that supported cities for centuries become unfamiliar beneath their feet. Civilizations rise by learning the habits of water, but water has never promised to keep those habits forever. Water gives civilization its first confidence, and then slowly or suddenly it reminds people that confidence is not control. A river can be worshipped, measured, channeled, named, taxed, and built beside for 1,000 years, but it remains alive in ways no palace fully understands. It carries silt from mountains no farmer has seen. It cuts new paths through soft ground. It abandons old beds. It rises too high, too low, too early, or too late. It feeds cities, and it can also erase the assumptions on which those cities were built. In the ancient world, water is not scenery. It is infrastructure calendar, border road, weapon, blessing, and threat all at once. The most stable civilizations often appear to be those that learn water's rhythms, but learning a rhythm is not the same as owning it. Along the Nile, the annual inundation becomes the pulse of Egyptian life. In Mesopotamia, irrigation turns dry plains into productive fields. In the Indus region, settlements grow within a broad world of rivers, monsoon patterns, floodplains, and shifting channels. In China, communities along great river systems learn to live with both fertility and catastrophic flood. Everywhere, water promises surplus if people can organize themselves around it. But every canal, reservoir, levee, and drainage system adds a condition. The landscape must continue to behave within the range the system expects. When it does not, the change may be almost invisible at first. A canal that once flowed freely carries more silt. A field that once yielded well begins to crust white at the surface. A harbour that once received ships grows shallow. A river that once passed near a city moves farther away after floods reshape its course. The first generation calls it a problem. The second calls it a burden. The third may inherit a settlement whose location no longer makes sense. Archaeologists sometimes find cities that seem strangely misplaced standing in dry zones near abandoned channels or beside landscapes that no longer match the scale of their remains. The stones remain, but the water world that justified them has moved on. The Indus civilization offers one of the most intriguing examples of this slow transformation. Its great urban centers, including Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, show careful planning, standardized weights, craft production, drainage systems, and wide trade connections. Yet its decline does not look like a simple invasion or a single fiery end. Many settlements change gradually. Urban life becomes less centralized. Long-distance exchange appears to weaken. Some populations shift eastward or into smaller communities. Scholars still debate the precise causes because the evidence remains incomplete, and the script of the Indus civilization is still undeciphered. But changing river systems and shifting monsoon patterns likely played important roles. Some rivers in the greater Indus world altered course over time, and the drying or migration of channels may have disrupted agricultural patterns and settlement networks. A city can survive many hardships if its water remains reliable. But when the river that supports fields, transport, and identity becomes unpredictable or distant, the entire logic of urban life changes. The decline of Indus urbanism may not have been a dramatic collapse in the familiar sense. It may have been a long adaptation to a transformed water landscape, where large cities became harder to sustain, and smaller, more dispersed ways of living made better sense. What looks like disappearance from the viewpoint of monumental urbanism may have been survival through decentralization. In Mesopotamia, the danger often comes not only from too little water, but from the consequences of irrigation itself. The Tigris and Euphrates do not behave like gentle servants. They flood unpredictably, shift channels, deposit silt, and require constant management. Irrigation can create abundance in arid lands, but if water is poorly drained, salts in the soil rise toward the surface as water evaporates. Over time, salinization can damage crop yields. This does not happen like a battle or a plague. It is quieter, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. Each year the field gives a little less, and each year the system demands what it demanded before. There is evidence that parts of southern Mesopotamia struggled with soil salinity over long periods, and some scholars have connected this to shifts in crop choices, such as the greater reliance on barley, which tolerates salt better than wheat. The exact scale and political consequences are debated, and no single environmental process explains the long history of Mesopotamian change. Still, the pattern is revealing. A technology that creates civilization's wealth can also create its future weakness. Irrigation is not simply a solution imposed on nature. It is a relationship, and if that relationship is poorly balanced, the land begins to answer back. Floods can be just as destabilizing. A good flood renews fields, a bad flood destroys them. Too much water can smash houses, drown livestock, contaminate wells, collapse storage buildings, and spread disease. Flood disasters are especially dangerous in dense settlements because they attack both food and shelter at once. They also expose inequality. Elite buildings may be raised better drained or rebuilt more quickly, while poorer districts remain waterlogged and ruined. A society may interpret a flood as divine anger, bad kingship, or a failure of ritual, but whatever the explanation, the material damage must still be faced. Grain lost, walls, weakened roads, cut families, displaced labor redirected from production to repair. Ancient China preserves deep memories of flood control as a foundation of rulership. Stories of culture heroes taming waters may be layered with myth, but they point toward a real political truth. The ability to manage rivers becomes a sign of legitimate authority. Along the Yellow River, rich low soils support agriculture, but the river's sediment load can make it dangerously prone to flooding and course changes. A state that protects fields from flood appears powerful. A state that fails may seem to have lost the mandate to rule. Even when later ideas are projected backward into earlier periods, the connection between hydraulic control and political legitimacy remains unmistakable. Water management is never only engineering. It is government made visible in mud banks, channels, and survival. Harbours and coasts add another dimension. A port city depends on water as passage. Ships bring food, timber, metals, pottery, people, news, and danger. But coastlines are not fixed. Sediment can choke harbours. Earthquakes can raise or lower land. Storms can damage facilities. Sea levels shift across long spans. A city whose wealth depends on maritime exchange may decline if its harbour becomes difficult, unsafe, or strategically irrelevant. In some cases, people dredge, rebuild, or move facilities. In others, the cost of maintaining the old connection becomes too great. A harbour silting up is not as dramatic as an invasion, but to merchants and rulers it can be just as consequential. Trade does not vanish all at once. It chooses easier routes. One lesser-known aspect of water collapse is the burden of repair after repeated damage. Ancient infrastructure is not self-healing. Reservoirs fill with sediment. Canals require clearing. Terraces need walls reset. Drainage channels clog. Wells collapse. Flood defences weaken. If a society is wealthy, organised and trusted, it can mobilise labour to restore these systems. But when harvests are poor, elites divided or people exhausted, maintenance is postponed. Postponement becomes degradation. Degradation reduces production. Reduced production makes future maintenance even harder. The system enters a downward spiral that may leave no single catastrophic layer for archaeologists to find. This is why the most important ruins are sometimes not palaces or temples, but the remains of water systems. A broken canal tells a story of labour no longer summoned or no longer obeyed. A silted reservoir suggests lost coordination, population decline, or a shift in priorities. Abandoned terraces show that a landscape once carefully held in place has been released. Ancient engineers were often astonishingly skilled, but their work depended on social continuity. Stone may be durable, but maintenance is a social act. When society frays infrastructure begins to remember, water also changes the emotional world of a civilization. People build rituals around it because water is too important to remain merely practical. Rain gods, river gods, flood myths, purification, rites, offerings, sacred springs and ceremonies for fertility all reveal dependence turned into meaning. When water fails or turns destructive, the crisis is not only agricultural, it is spiritual and political. The priests may perform the old rites, but the fields still crack. The king may claim favour, but the flood still ruins the lowlands. The community may sacrifice prey repair and wait, yet the landscape no longer responds as expected. Scholars still debate how ordinary people understood these failures, but it is difficult to imagine that repeated environmental disruption left belief untouched. And yet water-driven collapse is rarely simple disappearance. People follow water. They move towards surviving channels, better rainfall, reliable wells, new ports, higher ground, or regions where old skills can be used differently. A river's change can destroy one city while feeding another. A floodplain abandoned by one population can be reclaimed centuries later by another. A dry channel can become a road. A ruined harbour can become an inland memory. Civilizations fall out of alignment with their landscapes, but human communities keep searching for new alignments. The old cities remain behind as evidence of a relationship that once worked. Their drains, canals, wells, basins, docks, embankments and fields show the intelligence of people who understood their world deeply, even if they could not freeze it in place. The tragedy is not that they were ignorant of water. Often they knew it better than almost anyone alive today could know it. The tragedy is that knowledge built for one pattern may fail when the pattern changes. A civilization can master a river for centuries and still be defeated by a century in which the river becomes something else. So the story of collapse widens again. Drought can weaken the harvest, but rivers changing course can erase the map. Irrigation can feed cities, but also poison fields. Floods can renew the land, but also break the trust between people and rulers. Harbours can open the world, then slowly close with mud. Beneath the grand drama of kings and battles lies a quieter truth. Many ancient civilizations were balanced on moving water. When that balance shifted, the damage spread into grain, labour, trade, belief and authority. But water is still only one part of the larger unravelling. Once harvests fail, roots change, and infrastructure weakens. The human world begins to move as well. Traders alter paths, villagers leave home, soldiers become harder to feed. Borderlands grow restless. Strangers appear at gates, not always as conquerors, but sometimes as hungry families, displaced workers, broken armies, and people searching for the same vanishing security. Environmental stress does not stay environmental for long. It becomes migration, conflict, fear, and rumour. And in one of the most famous turning points of the ancient world, those pressures gather into a collapse so wide that entire palace kingdoms go dark. By the time the Bronze Age begins to unravel, the world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East is not a collection of isolated kingdoms staring suspiciously across empty horizons. It is connected, wealthy, ambitious, and astonishingly dependent on movement. Ships cross between islands and coasts carrying copper, tin oil, wine, pottery, grain. Textiles, timber, ivory glass, and luxury objects made to impress people who already have too much. Palaces exchange gifts as diplomacy. Kings address one another as brothers even when they are rivals. Scribes record shipments, treaties, marriages, tribute, and requests with the calm precision of people who believe the system will continue. A royal court in Anatolia may care about events in Syria. A ruler in Egypt may receive messages from far beyond the Nile. A merchant's cargo can contain materials whose origins lie hundreds or thousands of miles apart. The Bronze Age world is not modern, but it is already deeply international. That is what makes its collapse so unsettling. Around the centuries surrounding 1200 BCE, many palace-centered societies across the Eastern Mediterranean suffer destruction, contraction, or transformation. Mycenaean palaces in Greece are burned or abandoned. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disappears as a great political power. Cities in the Levant experience destruction and disruption. Trade patterns shift. Writing systems tied to palace administration vanish in some regions. Monumental authority weakens. The old diplomatic world of royal letters, gifts, and controlled exchange fractures. Later ages remember pieces of this time through legends, migrations, and heroic ruins, but the historical reality is more tangled than any single epic. It is tempting to imagine one great invading force sweeping across the map and ending the Bronze Age in fire. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions mention groups often called the Sea Peoples, and for a long time they were treated almost as the explanation itself. Foreign warriors arrive, cities burn, empires collapse. It is dramatic, clear, and easy to picture. But the evidence does not allow such simplicity. The Sea Peoples matter, but they are not a magical key that unlocks every ruin. Some destructions happen at different times. Some sites show fire, others abandonment, others continuity. Some groups named in Egyptian records may have been migrants, raiders, displaced communities, mercenaries, or coalitions formed by crisis. Scholars still debate who they were, where they came from, and whether they were mainly a cause of collapse, a symptom of collapse, or both. The deeper mystery is that the Bronze Age palace system had become powerful through interdependence. Palaces did not merely rule, they coordinated. They gathered agricultural surplus, supported specialist crafts, controlled luxury production, distributed rations, organized labor, maintained armies, and managed exchange. In places like Mycenaean Greece, Linear B tablets reveal a world of careful palace administration, listing workers, animals, textiles, bronze chariot parts, offerings and commodities in remarkable detail. These records are not grand literature. They are the paperwork of a system that tracks things because it must. The palace stands at the center, like a brain receiving information and sending orders through a body of farms, workshops, storehouses, and dependent people. But a centralized system can be brittle. If the palace burns, the administrative structure tied to it may vanish quickly. A village can continue without a palace, but the scribal system, redistribution network, elite craft workshops, and long-distance diplomatic obligations may not. In some regions, after the collapse, people still farm, herd, trade locally, and live in communities, but the scale changes. The world becomes less literate in certain places, less monumental, less connected to the old palace economy. Collapse is not the end of life. It is the end of a particular complexity. The Bronze Age collapse appears to have been a cascade. Climate stress may have reduced harvests and increased pressure on food systems. Drought evidence from parts of the eastern Mediterranean suggests difficult conditions during this broad period, though the timing and severity vary by region. Famine or shortage in one kingdom could create unrest, weaken armies, and push people toward migration. Earthquakes may have damaged some sites, though earthquakes alone cannot explain the whole pattern. Warfare clearly played a role in many destructions, but warfare itself may have intensified because of scarcity, political rivalry, and weakening authority. Trade disruption would have been especially dangerous because bronze requires both copper and tin is often distant. If a palace cannot obtain enough metal, timber, food, or prestige goods, its military and ideological power suffers. One striking detail from this world is how much anxiety appears in some late Bronze Age communications. Letters from the final years of certain cities and kingdoms speak of ships, enemies missing support, and urgent danger. These messages do not read like people calmly managing an ordinary crisis. They suggest a world in which rulers know that threats are multiplying and assistance may not arrive. Yet even here the record is fragmentary. A desperate letter from one city does not explain a century of regional transformation. It gives a flash of lightning and a storm whose full shape remains hidden. The collapse of the Hittite Empire shows the difficulty of assigning one cause. The Hittites had built a major power in Anatolia, competing and negotiating with Egypt and controlling important territories. Yet their empire depended on political cohesion, food supply, military strength, and control of routes through a challenging landscape. By the early 12th century BCE, the imperial structure disappears. The capital at Hattusa is abandoned and destroyed, though evidence suggests parts of the site may have been evacuated before final burning. That detail matters. It hints that collapse was not necessarily a sudden surprise attack on a thriving capital. It may have involved a planned withdrawal, internal weakening food problems, political fragmentation, or strategic relocation before violence completed the ruin. The Hittite world did not vanish entirely. Successor states and related traditions continued in different forms, especially in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. But the empire as an imperial system was gone. In Mycenaean Greece, the palatial centres also fall or transform. The great sites later associated with heroic legend Mycenae Pylos Tyrans, Thebes, belong to a world of fortified centres, elite burials, administrative tablets, and regional power. Some palaces are destroyed by fire. The palace at Pylos, for example, preserves tablets baked accidentally in destruction, giving modern scholars a final administrative snapshot of a system near its end. The tablets do not describe the collapse directly, but they reveal intense organization, including military preparations in some interpretations. After the palace's fall, the Linear B writing system disappears for centuries. Greeks continue living in Greece, of course, but the palace order that recorded itself in that script does not survive. This loss of writing is one of the clearest signs that collapse can be institutional rather than biological. People remain, speech remains, memory remains. But the need and support for a particular writing system vanish when the bureaucracy that used it disappears. Writing is not just knowledge, It is employment, training, archives, materials, and authority. When the palace no longer requires records, scribal traditions can die surprisingly fast. The silence that follows is not because no one has thoughts worth recording. It is because the machinery that turned speech into administrative text has broken. The Eastern Mediterranean after 1200 BCE does not become empty. That's another common misunderstanding. Some areas suffer severe decline while others adapt, shift, or eventually flourish in new ways. The Phoenician cities of the Levant, for example, become major maritime powers in the early Iron Age. New kingdoms emerge. Iron technology spreads more widely not overnight, and not simply as a replacement for bronze, but as part of a changing economic and political landscape. Smaller polities, new identities, and different trade networks form from the ruins of the older system. Collapse clears space brutally and unevenly for reorganization. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so important is that it shows how a whole international order can fail without one master cause. It is a warning against simple stories. Invasion without drought does not explain everything. Drought without warfare does not explain everything. Earthquakes, rebellion, piracy, migration, trade, disruption, and technological change all matter in different places, but no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. The old system may have been vulnerable precisely because it was so interconnected. A shock in one region moved through the network. A shortage became a diplomatic crisis. A diplomatic crisis became a military opportunity. A military defeat became a trade disruption. A trade disruption became palace weakness. Palace weakness became local instability. Local instability produced refugees, raiders, and new powers. The most human part of the story lies in those moving people. To settled palace elites, outsiders arriving by land or sea could appear as invaders. To the outsiders themselves, the movement may have been survival. Some may have been warriors seeking plunder. Some may have been families displaced by hunger or war. Some may have been former mercenaries no longer paid by collapsing states. Some may have been communities pushed from their own failing systems. The categories blur when order breaks down. A refugee can become a raider if refused food. A soldier can become a migrant if his kingdom falls. A trader can become a smuggler when official routes close. A border can become a battlefield when too many desperate people press against it. The Bronze Age palaces did not fall because ancient people were foolish. They fell in part because their world had become difficult to simplify. Too many regions depended on too many distant relationships, and the institutions built to manage abundance were not flexible enough under prolonged stress. The same routes that carried wealth could carry panic. The same diplomacy that linked kings could fail when each court had its own crisis. The same palaces that organized production could become single points of failure. When fire reached them, it was burning more than buildings. It was burning the administrative memory of an entire way of life. Afterward, the ruins stood as more than ruins. They became raw material for legend. Later Greeks looked back toward a heroic age of great walls and vanished kings. Peoples of the Near East remembered upheavals, migrations, and divine judgments through layered traditions. Archaeologists today find burnt floors, broken pottery, abandoned archives, weapons, storage jars, and rebuilt settlements. But the full emotional experience remains beyond reach. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, one thing is clear: the Bronze Age did not end in a single night. It ended through a widening failure of confidence, food movement, authority, and connection. And when connection fails, strangers become more frightening. A ship on the horizon is no longer only a merchant vessel. A caravan on the road may be hungry. People, armed men, or both. A neighbor who once traded peacefully may now compete for grain. the collapse of the palace world turns movement into danger and danger into movement. That is where the next layer of the story waits, not in the simple image of invaders destroying peaceful civilizations, but in the darker, more complicated reality of raiders. Refugees, soldiers, migrants and border peoples caught inside the same unravelling world. Word count motenghin namtramlehai. Awaiting continue tip motenghin, batramchu ja suinghi trongvegi section bay. When ancient civilizations collapse, later generations often search the ruins for an enemy. It is a human instinct and a powerful one. A burned gate seems to demand an attacker. A smashed statue suggests hatred. Weapons found near a wall invite an image of desperate last defense. Ancient texts themselves often encourage this view, because rulers prefer to blame outsiders when the world breaks under their watch. Foreigners become the face of chaos. Raiders become the explanation for hunger, fear, and lost authority. But the deeper pattern is rarely so clean. Invaders, raiders, and refugees often appear not as the first cause of collapse, but as signs that a wider system is already failing. Borders are strongest when the centre is strong. A well-fed state can maintain garrisons, pay soldiers, repair fortifications, reward allies, and manage diplomacy with neighbouring peoples. It can absorb small raids, negotiate with migrants, hire mercenaries or settle outsiders under controlled conditions. But when harvests fail, treasuries shrink, rulers quarrel, and local officials act independently, borders become thin. A frontier that once filtered movement begins to leak. Armed groups cross more easily. Displaced families arrive in larger numbers. Trade caravans travel with heavier guards or stop altogether. The state describes these movements as threats, and sometimes they are. Yet many of the people moving may be responding to the same pressures that are weakening the state itself. This is why the line between invader and refugee can become disturbingly narrow. A community leaving a drought-stricken homeland may arrive at another kingdom's edge hungry and frightened. If welcomed, they may become settlers, workers, soldiers, or subjects. If rejected, they may raid. If armed, they may be remembered only as enemies. If desperate enough, they may attack storehouses or join larger coalitions of displaced people. Ancient records, usually written by states, tend to preserve the viewpoint of those defending walls, not those approaching them with nowhere else to go. What survives in the record suggests violence, but it does not always tell us whether that violence began as conquest, survival, revenge, or a failed negotiation. The Roman world, much later than the Bronze Age, offers a familiar version of this problem, though its scale and institutions are different. Peoples beyond the imperial frontiers were not simply waiting for a chance to destroy Rome. Many traded with the empire, served in its armies, sought land, fled other enemies, or became entangled in Roman politics. When the empire was strong, it could manage these relationships with a mixture of force, diplomacy, bribery, settlement, and recruitment. When internal instability, fiscal strain, political division, plague, and military pressure mounted, the same frontier movements became harder to control. Groups that had once been clients or allies could become invaders in Roman eyes, while from their own perspective they might be seeking security inside a richer but weakening world. Scholars still debate the relative weight of migration invasion and internal decay in Rome's Western collapse, but few serious explanations reduce it to barbarians suddenly appearing from nowhere. The same caution applies to earlier collapses. In Mesopotamian history, pastoral and semi-nomadic groups often appear in settled texts as troublesome outsiders. They are blamed for raids, disorder, or pressure on cities. Yet these groups are also part of the same regional economy. They trade animals, wool labour, and military service. They move through landscapes where farming is risky and rainfall varies. During periods of drought or political weakness, their movements may increase, and settled states may interpret that movement as invasion. But the relationship between herders and farmers is not simply hostility. It is exchange-dependent suspicion and competition, shifting with environmental and political conditions. When collapse comes, old tensions harden into blame. Warfare itself changes under stress. In stable periods, war can be organized by states with defined goals: conquest tribute, border control, prestige, dynastic rivalry. In unstable periods, violence becomes more fragmented. Soldiers unpaid by a collapsing palace may become independent armed bands. Mercenaries may shift allegiance. Local governors may fortify their own centers. Farmers may flee to defensible sites. Trade routes may attract raiders because moving goods become easier to seize than produce. A world of official armies can slide toward a world of private violence. The archaeological signs may include hastily built walls, destruction layers, weapons in unusual places, settlements moved to hilltops, or valuable objects hidden and never recovered. Hidden hoards are among the most haunting clues. Across different ancient contexts, archaeologists sometimes find collections of metal tools, jewelry, coins, weapons, or valuables buried in the ground. Not every hoard is evidence of crisis. Some are ritual deposits, stored metal or wealth concealed for ordinary reasons. But in periods of instability, a buried treasure that no one returns to claim suggests a moment of fear. Someone believes danger is near. Someone hides what matters. Then that person dies, flees, is enslaved, or never finds the chance to come back. The objects survive because the owner's plan fails. It is a small, silent record of broken expectation. Fortifications tell another story of fear. Cities always build walls for many reasons: defense, status, boundaries, control of movement, display of power. But when walls are strengthened quickly, when entrances are narrowed, when settlements relocate to more defensible terrain, or when weapons become more common in domestic areas, the atmosphere of daily life may be changing. A society under pressure begins to reorganize around danger. People sleep differently behind a threatened gate. Farmers working beyond the walls look toward the horizon more often. Merchants wonder whether the road is worth the risk. The city may remain alive, but its energy turns inward. Ancient texts often transform these fears into moral geography. Outsiders are portrayed as wild, impure, godless, chaotic, or less human. This language helps states create unity against danger, but it also hides complexity. The people called barbarians, mountain tribes, desert nomads, sea raiders, or enemies are usually not faceless masses. They have families, leaders, traditions, grievances, and strategies. Some are as politically sophisticated as the states that condemn them. Some understand imperial weakness better than imperial elites do. Some are drawn into conflict because powerful states first used them as soldiers, laborers, trading partners, or buffer communities. When order fails, yesterday's useful outsider can become today's existential threat. There is also the possibility of internal raiding, which official narratives may disguise as foreign attack. When tax burdens become unbearable, when famine spreads, or when local authority breaks down, people from within a civilization may turn against its institutions. Storehouses are tempting targets. Temples hold wealth. Palaces symbolize extraction as well as protection. A destruction layer might reflect invasion from outside rebellion, from inside factional conflict among elites, or some combination of all three. Archaeology can sometimes distinguish patterns, but not always. Burned buildings do not carry labels naming the hands that lit the fire. The collapse of the Bronze Age palace world likely involved this kind of blurred violence. Some cities may have been attacked by external groups. Others may have fallen through internal conflict. Some may have been abandoned before final destruction. Some may have been destroyed by people who were themselves displaced from other collapsing regions. The famous image of the sea peoples landing in waves of conquest may contain a real memory of movement and warfare, but it cannot explain the full system failure. The raider and the refugee are not always separate figures. Sometimes they are stages in the same life. This does not mean invasion is unimportant. Armed attack can absolutely break states, massacre populations, destroy archives, interrupt trade, and shatter confidence. A city already weakened by drought or political division may still experience its final collapse through violence. The arrival of a hostile force can turn long decline into sudden disaster. People die in such moments. Houses burn, families scatter, captives are taken, sacred places are desecrated. To soften this into mere systemic change would miss the terror of collapse as lived experience. But to treat violence as the whole explanation would miss the conditions that made the violence so effective. One of the most unsettling truths is that collapse creates opportunities. A weakened state invites attack because its defences are stretched. Its rivals may seize borderlands. Its vassals may rebel. Its mercenaries may demand more. Its subjects may stop obeying. Groups outside the system may see the chance to take land, food, animals, or status. Even neighbouring states that once exchanged gifts may become predators when scarcity sharpens calculation. In this way, collapse can become contagious. One kingdom's weakness encourages actions that make the weakness worse, and those actions destabilize others in turn. Yet the same movements can also carry renewal. Migrants bring skills, languages, crops, technologies, religious practices, and new political possibilities. Peoples displaced by one collapse may help build the next order. The early Iron Age world that follows the Bronze Age breakdown is not merely poorer and darker, it is also changing. New communities emerge, new trade networks form, and cultural identities take shape in the aftermath. The violence is real, but so is adaptation. History does not stop at the burned gate. The old civilizations feared movement because movement made control harder. Farmers tied to fields can be taxed. Workers attached to palaces can be counted. Merchants on known routes can be monitored. Migrants, raiders, refugees, and mobile warriors disrupt the categories on which states depend. They slip between names: foreigner, soldier, settler, enemy, servant, ally, bandit. In times of stability, the state tries to assign them a place. In times of collapse, they reveal how fragile those assignments always were. So the story of invasion must be turned inside out. Outsiders do not simply arrive from beyond history to destroy peaceful worlds. They move through landscapes already strained by drought, failed harvests, broken trade elite rivalry, and weakening belief. They are sometimes destroyers, sometimes survivors, sometimes both. They accelerate collapse, but they also expose it. And behind the fear of the stranger lies a deeper fear that the centre can no longer hold its own people together. For once, subjects begin to doubt the palace, once soldiers doubt their pay, once farmers doubt the justice of taxation, and once local leaders doubt the value of loyalty. The enemy outside the wall is only one part of the danger. The other danger is already inside the system, waiting in the cost of power itself. Power is expensive long before it becomes corrupt. It must be fed, clothed, housed, guarded, displayed, recorded, praised, and defended. Every palace, temple, court, army, road, and monument rests on a flow of resources, moving from many hands toward a centre. In periods of abundance, that flow can feel tolerable, even useful. The centre stores grains, sponsors, rituals, commands, soldiers, settles, disputes, organises labour, and returns part of what it takes in the form of protection, employment, spectacle, and meaning. But when the balance shifts, when the centre takes more than it gives back, power begins to feel less like order and more like extraction. A civilization can survive enemies' drought, and even famine more easily when people still believe the burdens are shared. It becomes far more fragile when the population suspects that suffering flows downward while privilege gathers above. Ancient states are built on inequality. This does not mean every hierarchy is identical or that all people experience power in the same way, but large-scale ancient civilization almost always creates distance between those who produce and those who command. Farmers grow the grain. Herders raise the animals. Fishers, potters, weavers, miners, quarrymen, boatmen, brickmakers, and labourers provide the material life of society. Above them stand officials, priests, scribes, warriors, landholders, palace households, royal kin and temple institutions that claim authority over storage, taxation, ritual law and violence. The system can function for centuries if enough people accept its rules, fear its punishments, or depend on its benefits. But inequality is not merely a moral problem. It is a structural weakness. It concentrates decision-making in narrow circles that may be insulated from the consequences of their own choices. The palace sees the harvest as numbers. The farmer feels it as weather, soil, aching hands, pests, debt, and children waiting for food. A tax quota may look reasonable in an archive because it resembles last year's figure. In the village, the same quota may mean surrendering seed grain after a poor season. An official may insist that obligations are ancient and sacred. A household may know that obedience now risks starvation later. When the distance between record and reality grows too wide, administration becomes violence by measurement. The state may not need to send an army to every field. It only needs to keep demanding what the field can no longer give. Forced labour is one of the clearest signs of the cost of power. Many ancient states rely on corvée labour, seasonal service or other forms of compulsory work for canals, roads, walls, temples, tombs, palaces and military logistics. These systems are not always experienced as slavery in the narrow sense. In some societies, labour obligations are embedded in ideas of duty, taxation, religious service or communal contribution. During stable times, people may accept them as part of the bargain of belonging to a larger order. Yet even accepted obligations can become unbearable if they are poorly timed, excessive, or used for elite display, while local needs are ignored. A canal repair that protects fields may feel necessary. A monument built while granaries shrink can feel like betrayal. There is surprising fragility in grandeur. Massive building projects prove that a state can mobilize labor, but they also reveal how much the state consumes to preserve its image. A ruler who builds during prosperity may strengthen legitimacy. A ruler who builds during crisis may be trying to manufacture legitimacy from stone because reality no longer provides it. The monument says the king is powerful. The ration line may say something else. Archaeology can admire the monument and still ask the harder question, who paid for this with time, food and bodies? Elite competition makes the burden heavier. Power rarely rests in the hands of one ruler alone. Royal families, noble houses, priests, governors, military leaders, merchants and scribal officials all compete for access to surplus. Each group may justify its privileges as necessary. The temple must receive offerings to maintain cosmic order. The army must be supplied to defend the land. The palace must reward loyalty. The nobility must sustain households appropriate to rank. Officials must be compensated. Artisans serving elites must be supported. In good times, the system can feed all these mouths. In bad times, elite claims do not shrink easily. Instead, they often harden. Those closest to power may protect their privileges precisely when the poor are losing theirs. This is one reason collapse can involve fragmentation. Provincial leaders who once served the centre begin to act like independent rulers. They keep local taxes, command local forces, build local monuments, and present themselves as protectors of their regions. From the viewpoint of the capital, this is rebellion or decay. From the viewpoint of a province neglected by the center, it may feel like survival. Egypt's periods of fragmentation show how regional elites could become powerful when royal authority weakened. Mesopotamian history repeatedly reveals cities and dynasties breaking from larger structures. The Maya lowlands show intense competition among royal courts, where prestige warfare and alliance could strengthen kingdoms in one generation and exhaust them in another. Scholars still debate the exact political dynamics in many cases, but the pattern is familiar. When central power becomes too costly or ineffective, loyalty becomes negotiable. Corruption is difficult to identify in ancient evidence, but its possibility is everywhere. Any system that moves goods through officials creates opportunities for theft, favoritism, falsification, and abuse. A ration can be reduced before it reaches a worker. A tax can be over-collected. A local official can hide grain from the palace or from hungry villagers. A priestly estate can preserve wealth while surrounding household struggle. A military commander can use state resources to build personal loyalty. Ancient texts sometimes complain about dishonest officials, unjust judges, predatory elites, and social disorder, though such texts are often stylized. Even so, they point to a recurring fear that those entrusted with order may become another form of danger. The danger becomes sharper when inequality undermines cooperation. Complex societies depend on people doing difficult things for collective systems they cannot fully see. Farmers must surrender surplus. Workers must appear when summoned. Soldiers must march. Scribes must record honestly enough for administration to function. Local leaders must transmit orders. Merchants must trust weights, roads, and agreements. If too many people conclude that the system is rigged beyond repair, they may still obey outwardly, but their commitment thins. They hide goods, they evade labor, they flee, they shift allegiance to local patrons, they welcome rebels, they stop caring whether the palace survives. This quiet withdrawal can be more dangerous than open revolt. Revolt announces itself. Withdrawal hollows the system from within. A city may still perform ceremonies, issue commands, and maintain walls, while the countryside becomes less cooperative. The center may respond with harsher extraction, which deepens resentment. It may send troops which require more grain. It may punish villages, which reduces production. It may reward loyal elites, which increases inequality. The system tries to solve distrust with force, and force is expensive. The cost of power rises at the exact moment the base supporting it is weakening. Ancient empires face this problem on a larger scale. Expansion brings tribute captives, land prestige, and access to resources. It also brings long borders, rebellious subjects, administrative complexity, and military commitments that never end. An empire can become trapped by its own success. To remain legitimate, it must keep winning, or at least keep appearing invincible. Defeat damages more than territory. It damages belief. A border loss can encourage rebellion elsewhere. A failed campaign can expose fiscal weakness. Conquered peoples may pay tribute while the empire is strong, then abandon loyalty when its armies stumble. Overextension is not simply having too much land. It is having obligations that outrun the state's ability to meet them. Rome later becomes the most famous example of this imperial burden, but the pattern is older. The Akkadian Empire had to hold together diverse cities and regions through force and administration. The Assyrian Empire later developed extraordinary military and bureaucratic capacity, but its harsh extraction and vast reach also generated enemies and revolts. Bronze Age palace kingdoms depended on tribute-controlled production and diplomatic prestige. Maya kingdoms competed intensely for captives, allies, and ritual authority. In each case, power must constantly reproduce itself. It cannot simply exist. It has to be performed, funded, and believed. Belief is crucial because inequality always needs explanation. Ancient societies explain hierarchy through divine order, ancestry, conquest, cosmic balance, tradition, law, or protection. The king rules because the gods favor him, because his bloodline matters, because he defeats enemies, because he feeds the people, because without him chaos would return. These explanations do not need to convince everyone equally, but they must remain strong enough to support obedience. When disasters accumulate, explanations weaken. If the gods favor the king, why does famine continue? If the palace protects the land, why are raiders near the fields? If taxes support order, why do officials enrich themselves while canals fail? No single failed promise destroys legitimacy, but repeated failure turns sacred language brittle. One lesser-known sign of internal strain is the changing pattern of settlement. In some collapsing regions, people move away from large centers into smaller, more defensible, or more dispersed communities. This can reflect fear, environmental stress, economic change, or rejection of centralized demands. Smaller settlements may leave fewer spectacular remains, so later observers mistake them for decline in human life itself. But from the perspective of those living through collapse, decentralization can be a strategy. A smaller community may be harder to tax, easier to defend locally, closer to fields, more flexible, and less dependent on elite institutions. The collapse of a state can be the liberation of a village from burdens. It no longer accepts, though, that liberation may come with insecurity, poverty, and loss. The cost of power is therefore measured not only in treasure, but in trust. A civilization can endure hierarchy if hierarchy appears functional. It can endure taxation if taxation returns protection. It can endure labor if labor maintains life-supporting infrastructure. It can endure rulers if rulers seem connected to prosperity, justice, and survival. But when power becomes too heavy, when it extracts, without protecting commands, without repairing, performs without delivering, and explains without convincing, it turns into dead weight on the society beneath it. This does not mean ancient people always thought in modern political terms. They did not need to. Hunger, debt, conscription, fear, and unfairness have their own clarity. A farmer may not speak of systemic inequality, but he knows when the official takes too much. A soldier may not analyze fiscal crisis, but he knows when rations are late. A craft worker may not debate legitimacy, but she knows when the palace no longer pays. A priest may not doubt the gods, but he may doubt the ruler who claims to serve them. Collapse begins when millions of such private calculations start to change. And once those calculations change, the sacred center becomes vulnerable. The palace, the temple, the throne, and the ritual order are not separate from politics. They are the language through which power justifies itself. If material life deteriorates, belief comes under pressure. If belief weakens, power must rely more heavily on force. If force becomes too costly, the system fractures. The next stage of collapse is not only in fields, borders, and taxes, but in the invisible world of meaning where kings lose their aura, temples lose offerings, and the old ceremonies continue under a sky that no longer seems to answer. Faith under pressure does not always break loudly. It can weaken first in the smallest private spaces in the silence, after a ritual that once felt powerful in the glance exchanged, when priests repeat the old words, and the fields still fail in the uneasy thought that the king's divine favor may not reach as far as the palace claims. Ancient civilizations do not separate religion from survival, in the way later observers sometimes imagine. The sacred is not only belief, it is calendar agriculture, kingship law, memory, death healing war, and the promise that the world has a pattern beneath its violence. When that pattern seems to hold, religion strengthens the whole social order. When disasters multiply, the same sacred order can become exposed to doubt. In many ancient states, kingship is not merely political command, it is cosmic responsibility. The ruler stands between human society and forces larger than society. Gods, ancestors, flood storms, fertility, enemies, disease, the dead, and the unseen powers that make harvest possible. In Egypt, the king's role is bound to mount the principle of order, balance, and rightness that holds chaos at bay. In Mesopotamia, kings build temples, restore cities, defeat enemies, and present themselves as chosen or supported by the gods, even if the gods remain unpredictable and sometimes terrifying. Among the classic Maya rulers, perform rituals, dedicate monuments, conduct warfare, and link dynastic time to cosmic cycles. In the Andes, later imperial authority draws deeply on sacred landscapes' ancestors and the ordering of labor and space. Across these different worlds, authority is strongest when it appears to make the universe legible. This sacred authority gives states remarkable power. It helps transform labor into duty. Digging a canal, carrying stone, delivering grain, serving in war, or making offerings can be framed not simply as obedience to officials, but as participation in a cosmic order. The temple is not only a building where gods are honored, it can be a landholder, employer archive, storehouse redistribution center, and symbol of continuity. Its festivals organize time. Its rituals gather people into shared emotion. Its priests preserve specialized knowledge. Its wealth becomes both spiritual and economic. To damage a temple is not merely to damage property. It is to strike at the visible point where the human and divine worlds meet. But that power creates a dangerous expectation. If rulers and temples claim to maintain order, then disorder asks questions of them. A single drought can be interpreted as a test, a warning, or divine displeasure that rituals may correct. A military defeat can be blamed on impurity, betrayal, neglect of offerings, or the anger of a particular god. Ancient religious systems are flexible, and they often contain ways to absorb failure. The gods may be displeased, the rites may need renewal, a ruler may need to restore temples, punish sinners, consult omens, or make greater offerings. But repeated disaster is harder to contain. If the rains fail again, if enemies return again, if famine spreads again, if children continue to die, then the explanations become strained. This is not the same as modern disbelief. Ancient people did not necessarily stop believing in gods because a harvest failed. In many cases, disaster could deepen religious fear rather than dissolve it. People might believe more intensely that divine anger was real. They might demand more rituals, seek new protectors, revive old cults, or turn to local shrines closer to their daily lives. The crisis may not be atheism, but a shift in sacred confidence. People may continue believing in the gods while doubting the king's relationship to them. They may continue honoring the temple while resenting its wealth. They may continue performing rituals while fearing they no longer work in the old way. The evidence remains incomplete because private doubt rarely survives in inscriptions. But what survives in the records suggests that political legitimacy and sacred order are deeply intertwined. Ancient rulers know this. In times of stress, they often present themselves as restorers. They rebuild temples, renew offerings, repair sacred images, cleanse sanctuaries, and proclaim that they have returned order after chaos. These claims are found across civilizations because they answer a recurring need. A ruler who inherits crisis must show that the connection between heaven and earth has been repaired. He does not simply govern, he heals the symbolic wound. Sometimes this restoration may reflect real recovery. Sometimes it may be propaganda covering deeper weakness. Either way, the language reveals the problem collapse is never only material, it is also a crisis in meaning. When the Old Kingdom in Egypt weakens and regional authorities grow stronger later, and local texts sometimes describe famine, social reversal, and the failure of order. These accounts are difficult to use as direct evidence because they are shaped by literary conventions and political agendas. Yet they reveal how Egyptians imagined collapse not just as administrative trouble, but as a world turned upside down. The poor suffer, authority falters, and the harmony between human society and cosmic order appears broken. The fear is not merely that a king has lost power, the fear is that the world has slipped toward chaos. In Mesopotamia, the collapse of cities and dynasties is often explained through divine abandonment. A god may leave a city, a temple may be desecrated, a foreign enemy may be interpreted as an instrument of divine judgment. Later literary works can describe devastation in language of mourning, turning ruined cities into sacred tragedies. These texts do not always give modern historians straightforward factual reports, but they preserve an emotional truth. The destruction of a city is felt as more than military defeat. It is the breaking of a relationship between community, deity, and place. When the god's house falls silent, the city has not only lost walls, it has lost the center of its identity. The Maya world offers another kind of pressure. Classic Maya kingship depends heavily on public performance, monument building, ritual bloodletting, calendrical authority warfare, and the display of dynastic continuity. Stele record rulers dates victories, ceremonies, and ancestral legitimacy. To carve a monument is to say that time itself has been ordered through the royal line. When many cities stop erecting dated monuments, it suggests not that time ended, but that the political system capable of publicly commanding time had weakened. Drought warfare and ecological stress could all damage the credibility of kings who performed rituals connected to fertility and cosmic renewal. No single explanation fully accounts for the decline of these royal courts, but the silence of monuments is a powerful sign. A ruler who cannot command labor, loyalty, or belief cannot keep carving eternity into stone. Temples and sacred centers can also become targets during collapse. Sometimes enemies destroy them to humiliate a rival city or seize wealth. Sometimes internal factions may attack symbols of authority. Sometimes sacred places are abandoned because the population around them disperses. The destruction of religious buildings can look like religious rejection, but it may instead reflect political warfare, economic desperation, or strategic violence. Still, the effect is profound. Once a sacred center is damaged and not restored, the old order loses one of its anchors. People may carry cults elsewhere, adapt practices in households, or shift devotion to other places, but the central institution has been weakened. There is a lesser-known but important economic side to religious crisis. Temples often hold land animals, stored goods, craft workshops, and labor obligations. They may be among the wealthiest institutions in a society. During stability, this wealth supports festivals, offerings, employment, redistribution, and prestige. During crisis, temple wealth can become controversial. Hungry people may resent grain locked inside sacred storehouses. Rulers may seize temple resources to fund armies or administration. Priests may defend privileges in ways that alienate others. Rival elites may use religious reform as a political weapon. The sacred economy can become a battlefield without ceasing to be sacred. Ritual itself can become heavier under pressure. A society facing drought may perform more ceremonies for rain fertility or divine forgiveness. A ruler facing invasion may make larger offerings. A city facing plague may search for impurity, neglected rites, or offended gods. These actions can create unity, but they can also consume resources. Animals sacrificed cannot pull ploughs or reproduce. Grain offered to temples may not feed households, though offerings may later be redistributed in some systems. Labor devoted to ritual display may compete with urgent repair. In a crisis, every act of devotion also has a material cost. Ancient people may not have separated these categories as modern analysts do, but the cost was still real. Yet faith is not only a burden, it can also preserve resilience. Communities survive collapse partly because rituals, myths, and sacred landscapes outlast states. A dynasty may fall, but a local shrine continues. A writing system may disappear, but seasonal ceremonies remain. A city may empty, but stories about its gods, founders, or ancestors travel with migrants. Religion can help people endure the end of political order by giving suffering a frame and continuity a language. It can soften rupture by making survival feel connected to something older than the fallen palace. This is why collapse does not erase culture as easily as it destroys institutions. People carry the sacred in memory, practice, body, and landscape. The danger to civilization arises when official religion is too tightly bound to a failing political structure. If the king is the guarantor of order, then disorder stains the king. If the capital is the sacred center, then the capital's fall shakes more than administration. If elite ritual claims to renew the world, then repeated drought exposes the gap between performance and result. If temples are seen as protectors but appear insulated from suffering, their holiness may become entangled with resentment. The sacred system that once unified people can become another measure of broken promises. Still, caution is necessary. Modern observers cannot easily measure ancient belief. A decline in temple offerings might reflect poverty, not skepticism. A change in burial practice might reflect migration fashion, social transformation, or theology. The abandonment of a ceremonial center might reflect environmental change rather than religious collapse. Scholars still debate how to interpret many of these signs. The inner lives of ancient people are among the hardest things to recover, but it is impossible to understand collapse without recognizing that meaning matters. People do not live by grain alone, and they do not obey power only because of force. They live inside stories about why the world is ordered, who protects it, what suffering means, and what must be done when danger comes. When those stories bend, civilization bends with them. A society can endure hunger if hope remains credible. It can endure war if leadership feels legitimate. It can endure sacrifice if sacrifice appears shared and meaningful. But when drought, invasion, taxation, corruption, and failed rituals all gather together, the old explanations may no longer carry the weight placed upon them. The gods may still be real to the people, but the palace speaking for them may sound less certain. The temple may still be holy, but its doors may no longer feel like the center of rescue. The king may still wear the symbols of order, but symbols cannot fill a granary. So the crisis of faith becomes another hidden crack. It runs beneath monuments, through ceremonies, across fields and into households, where people decide whether to stay, obey, give fight, flee, or look elsewhere for protection. And as belief weakens at the center, the practical burdens around the city grow heavier. Large populations still need food, workshops still need fuel, walls still need repair, fields still need fertility. Forests, soils, animals, and water systems still bear the cost of human concentration. Even sacred authority cannot escape ecology. A city may lose confidence in its gods slowly, but it can run out of wood, soil and food with brutal clarity. A city is a hunger made of walls. From a distance it may look like stone brick towers, temples, roofs, smoke and streets, but in truth it is an appetite concentrated in one place. Every morning it must be fed again. Grain must come in from fields beyond the horizon. Animals must be driven or slaughtered. Fish must be caught, dried, salted or traded. Wood must arrive for cooking fires, kilns, metalworking, construction and warmth. Water must be carried, channeled, stored or lifted. Clay must be dug. Reeds must be cut. Stone must be quarried. Fuel must burn constantly in places where people bake bread, fire pottery, smelt metal, make lime, cook meals, heat baths, or perform rituals. A city does not merely occupy a landscape, it consumes one. At first this consumption can feel like triumph. The city gathers people and makes them powerful together. It supports scribes, priests, builders, healers, traders, musicians, soldiers, officials, metal workers, potters, weavers, astronomers, and artists. It turns surplus into culture. It creates markets where strangers meet, workshops where skill deepens, and sacred spaces where a whole population can feel part of something larger than household survival. The density is intoxicating. More people mean more hands, more ideas, more labour, more defence, more ceremony, more wealth. But density also means dependence. A village may know the fields that feed it. A great city must trust a much wider world. The land around an ancient city often carries the first scars of its success. Forests retreat as wood is cut for beams, tools, boats, charcoal, firing bricks, and everyday cooking. Hillsides lose tree cover and become more vulnerable to erosion. Soil washes into rivers, canals, and fields. Flood patterns change. Wild animals disappear from nearby zones. Grazing animals crop vegetation close to the ground, especially when herds increase to feed growing populations or supply wool hides, milk transport and sacrifice. The city's demand reaches outward like invisible roots drawing life from a wider and wider territory. If the surrounding landscape is rich and resilient, this can continue for a long time. If it is fragile, the cost appears sooner. Deforestation is one of the oldest companions of civilization, though its effects vary greatly by region. In some places, woodland loss is gradual and managed. In others, it becomes a serious ecological pressure. Timber is not merely a convenience, it is essential material. Monumental architecture requires beams, scaffolding, sledges, rollers, boats, ramps, fuel and tools. Metallurgy requires high heat often produced with charcoal. Pottery and brick production consume fuel in large quantities. Even the simple act of feeding thousands of cooking fires every day changes the radius of resource extraction. As nearby wood becomes scarce, people must travel farther, spend more labour, use lower quality fuel, or shift to alternatives such as dung crop residues, reeds or imported timber. Each adaptation works, but each has consequences. Using dung for fuel, for example, can reduce the amount returned to fields as fertilizer. Burning crop residues may mean less organic matter goes back into soil. Cutting reeds can affect wetlands. Importing timber requires trade routes, ships, animals, political agreements, and wealth. Resource substitution is not failure, it is ingenuity. But it shows how a city's survival becomes increasingly complicated. The more local resources decline, the more the city depends on distant supplies, and the more vulnerable it becomes to disruption. A forest lost near the city may reappear as a trade problem far away. Soil is slower to complain, but when it does, the complaint can last centuries. Ancient farmers are often highly skilled. They know season seeds, local soils, pests, rainfall patterns, irrigation methods, and the behavior of animals. Many societies develop terraces, manuring, fallowing crop rotation, floodwater, Farming raised fields and other techniques to sustain production. It would be wrong to imagine ancient agriculture as careless by default. Yet large populations increase pressure. Fields may be cultivated more frequently. Marginal lands may be brought under the plough. Hillsides may be terraced beyond what can be maintained. Irrigation may raise yields while creating salinity problems in some settings. Overgrazing may reduce vegetation cover. A few decades of stress can undo systems that took generations to build. Soil depletion is especially dangerous because it can be mistaken for normal hardship. A field produces slightly less, then slightly less again. More land is cleared to compensate. More labor is demanded. More animals graze wider areas. More erosion follows. A society may respond to declining productivity by intensifying the very practices that cause the decline. This is not because people are foolish. It is because immediate survival often outranks long-term balance. A hungry household cannot always protect next century's soil. A ruler facing revolt cannot always reduce taxes for ecological recovery. A city needing grain cannot easily shrink its appetite. The Maya lowlands provide a powerful example of how urban growth, agriculture, forest use, and water management can become tightly linked. Classic Maya cities are not isolated temple islands in untouched jungle. They exist within heavily managed landscapes of fields, reservoirs, causeways, terraces, orchards, household gardens, and surrounding settlements. Many Maya communities are skilled at adapting to diverse environments, but some regions may have reached levels of population density that made them vulnerable during drought. Forest clearance could affect soil erosion and local water cycles. Agricultural intensification could feed cities during good times while leaving less margin during bad ones. The evidence remains complex, and scholars still debate how much environmental degradation contributed relative to politics and drought. But what survives in the record suggests that ecological pressure was not separate from royal ambition, warfare, and ritual life. The city's hunger was built into the landscape. In Mesopotamia, as already seen with irrigation and salinity, the problem is not only feeding people, but maintaining the agricultural base under state demands. Southern Mesopotamian cities rely on canal networks, labor coordination, and careful management of water and soil. When yields decline, whether from salinity, political instability, water problems, or conflict, the urban system feels it directly. Grain is not just food. It is wages, taxes, offerings, military supply, and political loyalty. A decline in fields becomes a decline in administration. If the state responds by demanding more from weaker land, the burden grows. In the Mediterranean, the pressure of fuel and agriculture is visible in long-term landscape change. Ancient societies build ships, fire, pottery, smelt metals, clear land for olives, vines, and grain, and graze animals across uplands. Some landscapes are resilient under mixed use. Others become degraded through erosion, especially where forests are removed and slopes are overworked. It is easy to exaggerate and blame every ancient decline on deforestation, and that would be misleading. Environmental change is local, uneven, and often reversible, but in certain regions the ecological costs of sustaining cities and fleets were real. A civilization's greatness can be measured not only in monuments, but in the altered hillsides that supplied them. Large cities also face the problem of sanitation and waste. Dense populations create refuse sewage, contaminated water pests, and disease risks. Some ancient urban cultures manage these challenges with impressive skill. The Indus cities are famous for drainage systems and carefully constructed bathing and wastewater features in many neighborhoods. Roman cities much later develop aqueducts, sewers, public baths, and complex water supply systems, though benefits are unevenly distributed. But even good infrastructure requires maintenance. drains clog, wells become contaminated, floods spread waste through streets, animals live close to humans, markets concentrate food scraps. In hot climates, rot moves quickly. A city that cannot manage its own waste becomes sickened by its density. Food supply itself becomes more precarious as urban populations grow beyond their immediate agricultural hinterlands. The city must import grain from farther away, which means roads, boat storage guards, contracts, and political stability. A bad harvest nearby can be offset if distant regions produce well and transport remains safe. But if several regions suffer at once, or if warfare disrupts movement, or if officials seize supplies before they reach markets, the city is trapped by its own size. Its population cannot simply scatter into fields already claimed exhausted or insecure. Urban hunger can become explosive because so many people feel it at once. There is a lesser-known contradiction in ancient urban success. Specialization makes societies brilliant but less self-sufficient. A master metalworker, scribe, sculptor, priest-soldier, or textile specialist may produce extraordinary value, but each depends on others for food. As cities grow more, people are removed from direct production. This allows culture to flourish, but it also means that a disruption in food supply affects people who cannot easily return to farming without land, tools, seed, and knowledge of local conditions. In a crisis, specialization can become vulnerability. The very skills that define civilization may depend on the surplus collapse destroys. Urban resource stress also feeds inequality. Elites may command the best water sources, protected storage, imported foods, shaded courtyards, and secure housing. Poorer residents may live in more crowded districts, rely on daily wages or rations, face higher exposure to disease, and suffer first when prices rise. A city under ecological pressure can become socially volatile. Food riots in later historical periods show the danger clearly, but the same basic pattern likely existed earlier. When urban people cannot access bread, grain, or water, legitimacy can evaporate quickly. A hungry countryside may flee, a hungry city may erupt. Still, ancient people are not merely victims of ecological limits. They build remarkable systems to expand those limits. Terraces hold soil on steep slopes. Reservoirs capture rain. Canals extend agriculture into dry lands. Raised fields manage wetlands. Agroforestry combines trees and crops. Seasonal movement reduces pressure on pastures. Trade brings food from surplus zones. Ritual calendars coordinate planting and harvest. Communal labor repairs infrastructure. Many societies endure for centuries because they adapt intelligently to difficult environments. Collapse comes not because humans use nature, but because the relationship between use, renewal, population, and power becomes unbalanced. The hardest part is that imbalance often becomes visible too late. A ruler can see a broken wall. He cannot easily see declining soil fertility across thousands of small fields until tax receipts fall. A priest can lead prayers for rain. He cannot restore a forest cut over generations. A merchant can find a new supplier for timber. He cannot guarantee the route will remain open during war. A farmer can add labor to a tired field. He cannot always reverse erosion if hillsides above have been stripped. Civilization lives inside delays. Damage accumulates quietly, and consequences arrive when memory has already normalized the damage. This is why ruins surrounded by harsh or empty landscapes can feel so mysterious. The mind asks why anyone would build there. Often the answer is that the landscape was different, or that human systems once made it productive, or that trade compensated for local limits. The emptiness around a ruin may be partly the result of the civilization itself, partly climate, partly later land use, partly erosion, partly shifting rivers, and partly our own incomplete understanding. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, but the question is essential. Every city is an ecological event. When a city becomes too large to feed, it does not necessarily starve all at once. It tightens, diets narrow, rations shrink, prices rise, poor households sell possessions, children are sent away, fields farther from the centre are pressed harder, fuel comes from greater distances, animals are slaughtered earlier, repairs are postponed, marginal neighbourhoods empty, elite storehouses become more guarded. Rumours spread about grain hidden by officials or temples. The city still stands, but its appetite has become fear, and fear changes behaviour. Farmers may keep grain from markets. Merchants may avoid dangerous roads. Officials may punish hoarding, real or imagined. Soldiers may be used to secure food rather than defend borders. Religious ceremonies may intensify. Migrants may arrive from failing rural zones, increasing pressure inside the walls. The city that once promised safety becomes another crowded place of uncertainty. Its size, once the proof of success, becomes the measure of the problem. Ancient collapse often begins when the landscape can no longer support the social form built upon it, or when the social form can no longer adapt to the landscape's limits. Forest, soil, water, animals, fuel and food are not background. They are the deep economy beneath coins, tablets, palaces and temples. Civilizations rise by organizing nature into predictable flows. They falter when those flows become too expensive, too damaged, or too uncertain to maintain. But even ecological strain does not act alone. Crowded cities, long-distance trade, military movement, animal domestication, hunger, and weakened bodies create another kind of vulnerability, one that can pass invisibly from person to person. A civilization under pressure may already be struggling with fields, forests, and water when sickness enters its streets. Disease does not need to understand politics to change history. It only needs bodies close together, routes along which to travel, and societies already carrying more strain than they admit. Disease is one of the quietest forces in the collapse of ancient civilizations, because it often leaves no burned wall, no broken weapon, no royal boast of victory, and no enemy name carved into stone. It enters through breathwater, insects, animals, wounds, hunger trade, and touch. It moves along the very routes that make civilization powerful. A road built for armies can carry infection. A ship loaded with grain can also carry rats, fleas, contaminated water, or sick sailors. A market that gathers strangers from distant places can exchange more than goods. A city that concentrates people, animals, waste, and food becomes a living experiment in proximity. Civilization creates connection, and connection gives disease a path. In the deepest past, small mobile communities certainly suffered illness, injury, parasites, and infection. But dense, settled life changes the scale and character of disease. Farming brings humans into close contact with domesticated animals. Villages and cities place households near one another for long periods. Stored grain attracts rodents. Irrigation and standing water can encourage insects. Waste accumulates. Diets may become more restricted. Labor demands can weaken bodies. When populations grow large enough, certain infections can persist by constantly finding new hosts. In this sense, disease is not an accidental visitor to civilization. It is one of civilization's shadow companions. The archaeological evidence for ancient epidemics is difficult. Many diseases kill without marking bone. Soft tissues vanish. Written records may be absent, vague, symbolic, or shaped by religious interpretation. A text may describe plague, pestilence, fever, or divine wrath without identifying the pathogen in modern terms. Mass graves can suggest crisis, but they may reflect battle, famine, massacre, or ritual practice as well as disease. DNA studies have begun to reveal ancient pathogens in some remains, changing what scholars can know, but the record remains incomplete. For many ancient collapses, disease is suspected possible or locally important, yet hard to prove with confidence. Still, the logic is powerful. A society already weakened by drought, malnutrition, war, or displacement is more vulnerable to epidemic disease. Hunger lowers resistance. Crowding spreads infection. Refugees gather in camps, towns, ports, and fortified centers where sanitation may break down. Armies move across regions, mixing populations that might not otherwise meet. Trade connects distant disease environments. Dead animals and spoiled grain contaminate water and food. People under stress may abandon normal burial cleaning or quarantine practices, though ancient societies had many forms of practical disease management, even if they did not understand microbes. The sickness itself is biological, but its historical impact depends on social conditions. The ancient Near East and Mediterranean world knew pestilence as a terrifying presence. Hittite texts from the late Bronze Age preserve prayers connected to a devastating plague that afflicted the kingdom for years, possibly after military campaigns brought captives or infection into the land. These texts frame the disaster in religious and moral terms, asking why divine anger continues and what offense must be corrected. They do not give a modern medical report, but they show how disease could strike at royal legitimacy. A king can fight enemies, he can store grain, he can rebuild temples. But when invisible death moves through households and armies, the ruler's power appears painfully limited. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and later the Greco-Roman world, disease often sits at the edge of political crisis. It weakens labor forces, reduces harvest capacity, disrupts military campaigns, and creates fear that can be interpreted as divine displeasure. Priests, healers, magicians, physicians, and ritual specialists all become part of the response. Ancient medicine is not simply superstition. Many communities develop practical knowledge of wounds, herbs, surgery, cleanliness, diet, and symptoms. But epidemic disease can outrun available understanding. When many die at once, explanation itself becomes urgent. People need to know not only how to survive, but why the world has turned against them. Disease is also a demographic force. A severe epidemic can remove farmers, soldiers, craftspeople, mothers, children, scribes, priests and rulers in the same generation. It can break transmission of skills. It can leave fields untended and taxes unpaid. It can create succession crises if royal heirs die. It can weaken armies just as enemies press the borders. It can reduce urban populations enough that infrastructure becomes harder to maintain. A city depends on people not only as mouths to feed, but as hands to repair canals, clear drains, guard walls, bake bread, carry water, and remember procedures. When too many bodies disappear, the city's routines begin to fail. But disease does not need to kill a majority to destabilize a system. Fear itself alters behavior. Merchants may avoid infected cities. Villagers may flee officials. Families may abandon houses. Markets may shrink. Ritual gatherings may be disrupted or intensified in dangerous ways. Soldiers may desert. Workers may refuse assignments in affected areas. Rumors may spread faster than the illness. A ruler who cannot stop an epidemic may become vulnerable to rivals who claim greater divine favor, better omens, or harsher purification. The disease moves through bodies. The panic moves through institutions. In connected worlds, epidemics can also expose inequality. Wealthy households may retreat to rural estates, access better food command servants, or isolate more effectively. Poorer people may remain crowded in city districts dependent on daily rations or markets. Enslaved people, labourers, soldiers, and port workers may face the highest exposure. If the powerful are seen to escape while others die, disease deepens resentment. If temples and palaces demand offerings, taxes, or labour during pestilence, the burden can appear cruel. If officials seize grain in the name of emergency households, may experience the state itself as another infection spreading through their lives. One surprising detail is that the very achievements of ancient infrastructure could produce mixed results. Aqueducts, drains, baths, wells, and water channels can improve urban life, but they also require careful maintenance and may spread contamination if poorly managed. Irrigation can support agriculture while creating wet environments favourable to certain parasites or insects. Trade in food can prevent famine while widening exposure to unfamiliar pathogens. Roads allow rapid military response while accelerating movement of illness. Civilization does not create simple good or simple danger. It multiplies both at once. The later Roman Empire demonstrates this with unusual clarity, even though it belongs to a later part of the long story. Rome's roads, ports, armies, and cities create one of the most connected disease environments of the ancient world. Major epidemics such as the Antonine Plague and later the Plague of Cyprian appear to have caused serious demographic, military, and economic stress, though exact mortality remains debated. These epidemics did not single-handedly destroy Rome, but they weakened the system in ways that interacted with war taxation, political instability, frontier pressure, and economic strain. The pattern is familiar because it is broader than Rome. Disease rarely acts alone, yet it can make every other problem harder. For earlier civilizations, the role of disease is often more shadowed. Some scholars have considered whether epidemics contributed to the weakening of Bronze Age states, especially in a world of armies, captives, ports, and famine. The evidence is not strong enough to make disease the central explanation, but it remains plausible that sickness moved through stressed populations. In the Maya collapse, disease is not usually treated as a primary cause, in the same way drought warfare and political instability are but malnutrition and crowded conditions could have worsened health. In the Indus world, urban sanitation was advanced in many settlements, yet changing water systems, population movements, and declining urban organization may have altered health conditions. For each case, caution is necessary. The absence of proof is not proof of absence, but speculation must not be presented as certainty. Disease becomes especially dangerous when combined with famine. Malnourished bodies are less able to resist infection. Epidemics can then reduce the labor needed to produce the next harvest, creating further hunger. Families sell animals or tools to survive, reducing future resilience. Children who survive may grow weaker with lifelong consequences. A state collecting taxes from a sick and hungry population may find that its demands produce flight or rebellion instead of revenue. Temples receiving fewer offerings may lose economic functions. Armies recruited from depleted communities may become less effective. The epidemic passes, but its aftershocks remain in demography, production, and memory. Ancient people often interpreted disease through the sacred because invisible suffering demands meaning. A plague might be punishment, impurity, sorcery, angry ancestors, offended gods, bad omens, or the result of a ruler's failure. These explanations can lead to rituals of purification, offerings, processions, isolation, scapegoating, or reform. Sometimes ritual responses may provide comfort and social order. Sometimes they may intensify fear or target vulnerable people. The historical record rarely lets us see the full emotional range, but it is difficult to overstate the terror of a sickness that moves without visible cause. An army at the gate can be watched, A drought can be seen in the fields. Disease may already be inside the room before anyone knows the danger has arrived. The collapse of confidence is therefore as important as the collapse of health. If a civilization's institutions cannot protect bodies, feed survivors, bury the dead, maintain ritual order, and explain disaster, people may turn elsewhere. They may leave cities for smaller communities. They may seek new cults, healers, leaders, or patrons. They may blame foreigners, elites, sinners, gods, or rulers. They may accept harsher authority if it promises safety, or reject authority that seems useless. Disease does not need to overthrow a king by itself. It only needs to reduce the number of people who still believe the old system can preserve life. There is also the problem of memory. Epidemics can be remembered as divine judgment, as a dark age, as the fault of outsiders, or not remembered clearly at all if writing declines. A plague that kills scribes may leave fewer records of itself. A sickness in rural districts may never enter royal inscriptions unless it affects taxes, armies, or temples. A community traumatized by disease may preserve it in ritual burial customs or oral tradition that later historians cannot easily decode. The most devastating experiences are not always the best documented. Sometimes the silence in the record is itself part of the wound. And yet, as with drought war, an ecological strain disease also reveals resilience. Survivors adapt. They rebuild households, rework, inheritance, take over empty fields, change settlement patterns, honor the dead, and create new practices around purity, burial, healing, and community. A society may emerge from epidemic smaller, poorer, and more fearful, but not necessarily destroyed. The question is whether its institutions are flexible enough to reorganize after the shock. Some are. Others are already so strained that disease becomes the pressure that turns crisis into collapse. In the long story of ancient civilizations, sickness is rarely the most visible actor, but it waits behind many others. It follows armies into camps, merchants into ports, farmers into irrigated fields, animals into courtyards, refugees into crowded towns, and hungry people into ration lines. It exploits the same closeness that allows cities to flourish. It travels on the same roads that carry wealth. It finds weakness where drought, inequality, and war have already done their work. Disease is not always the cause of collapse, but it is often one of the shadows that lengthen as collapse approaches. By this point, the pattern has become unmistakable. Climate can strain the harvest. Water can shift the landscape. Trade can fracture. War can spread. Power can overreach. Faith can lose authority. Cities can outgrow their ecological base. Disease can move through the connected world. But these forces do not strike every civilization in the same way. To see how they combine inside one of history's most famous examples, the story must narrow again into the hot forests, reservoirs, plazas, royal courts, and carved stones of the classic Maya, where collapse did not mean disappearance, and where the mystery survives precisely because the people survived too. In the Maya lowlands, collapse does not begin in silence. It begins in places that are almost too alive to imagine as ruins. The air is heavy with heat, insect smoke, flowers, damp earth, and the calls of birds moving through the forest canopy. Causeways run between plazas. Reservoirs hold water through the dry season. Temples rise above city centers like stone mountains shaped by human hands. Scribes paint and carve signs that bind dynasties to sacred time. Kings stand before their people not merely as rulers but as ritual performers, war leaders, descendants, and living links between the human world and the deep order of the cosmos. Around them farmers work. Fields tend gardens, manage trees, carry goods, raise children, repair houses, and support the magnificent centre whose monuments still dominate the modern imagination. The classic Maya world is often described as though it suddenly vanished into jungle, but that image is deeply misleading. The Maya did not vanish. Maya people survived, adapted, migrated, resisted later empires, endured colonization, and remain living communities today. What collapsed in many regions was a particular form of classic period political and urban life, especially in the southern lowlands, the royal courts, the monument tradition, the dense city networks, and the authority of dynasties that once carved their victories and rituals into stone. This distinction matters because the old myth of disappearance turns living people into ghosts. The historical reality is more complicated and more powerful. It is not a story of extinction. It is a story of transformation under pressure. At its height, the classic Maya landscape is not a single empire like Rome, nor a centralized kingdom like some periods of Egypt. It is a mosaic of city-states, dynastic centers, alliances, rivalries, subordinate towns, sacred landscapes and agricultural communities. Cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Caracol, and many others participate in a political world of shifting power. Kings compete through warfare, marriage ritual, display, monument building, and control over people and resources. Their inscriptions record dates with extraordinary precision, placing human events inside vast cycles of time. They commemorate accessions, capture ceremonies, dedications, and victories. They do not record collapse as modern historians would wish. They present power as power wants to be seen, ordered, sacred, triumphant, continuous. Yet beneath the carved certainty lies a world of risk. Many Maya cities grow in environments where rainfall is seasonal and surface water can be scarce. Some regions lack large permanent rivers. Water storage becomes essential. Reservoirs, aguadas, wetlands, channels, and carefully managed landscapes allow dense populations to flourish. The achievement is enormous. A city rising in the lowlands is not simply placed in nature. It is engineered into survival through generations of local knowledge. But such success brings dependence. If rainfall patterns shift severely, if reservoirs fail, if population grows beyond what the system can buffer, or if warfare disrupts agricultural work and maintenance, the city's strength can become its weakness. The evidence for drought during the classic Maya collapse is among the most discussed pieces of the puzzle. Cave formations, lake sediments, and other climate records suggest repeated drought episodes between the 8th and 10th centuries in parts of the Maya region. These were not necessarily uniform everywhere, and scholars still debate their severity, timing, and local effects. But the pattern is strong enough to matter. In a world where kingship is tied to ritual order and communities depend on stored water through dry seasons, repeated drought is more than weather. It is a pressure on food health politics and belief at once. Imagine a city after one poor rainy season. The reservoirs still hold enough. The farmers worry, but they have seen hardship before. The king performs ceremonies. Offerings are made. Officials adjust. Families rely on stored maize beans, squash tree crops, and whatever local strategies have carried them through earlier stress. Now imagine the next dry period arrives before full recovery. Reservoir levels fall lower. Fields produce less. Some households begin to move. Tribute becomes harder to collect. Rival cities sense weakness. A ruler needs captives, prestige, and public ceremony to prove that divine favor remains, but the resources needed for display are exactly what stress is reducing. The system does not break because rain fails once. It weakens because the old methods of recovery no longer restore confidence. Warfare intensifies the strain. Classic Maya politics is competitive even in prosperous times. Capturing nobles, asserting dominance, controlling routes, and humiliating rivals are part of royal power. But under ecological pressure, war becomes more damaging. Armies and raiding parties disrupt planting, harvesting, trade and maintenance. Defeated cities may lose leaders, tribute networks and sacred legitimacy. Fortifications appear in some areas. Populations may shift toward defensible locations. What once served as elite competition can become a broader destabilizing force. Inscriptions that proudly record victories may in retrospect reveal a political world consuming itself when cooperation might have mattered more. The collapse is not simultaneous. That is one of the reasons the Maya case is so important. Some cities decline earlier, others continue longer. Some northern centers rise or transform while southern centers weaken. Local conditions matter. A city with better water storage, more flexible political organization, stronger trade connections, or less destructive rivalry might endure longer than a neighbor. This unevenness argues against any single explanation. Drought matters, but it does not produce the same result everywhere. Warfare matters, but war alone does not explain the climate evidence. Ecology matters, but environmental pressure does not automatically end dynasties. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The collapse is a braided event made from many strands pulled tight over generations. Population pressure is another strand. In many areas, classic Maya societies supported large populations through sophisticated agriculture. Terracing raised fields, managed forests, household gardens, wetland farming and intensive cultivation help sustain dense settlement. But more people mean less room for failure. When populations are high, marginal land may be cultivated, forests may be cleared more heavily, and soil may be pushed harder. The landscape becomes productive but less forgiving. During good periods, intensification feeds cities and supports royal grandeur. During drought, the same density magnifies hunger. A scattered population can move and adjust more easily than a crowded landscape tied to courts, ceremonies, fields, and obligations. One lesser-known detail is that Maya cities often include complex systems of managed vegetation, not simply cleared fields around stone temples. The old image of cities swallowed by untouched jungle after abandonment hides the fact that these landscapes were shaped by human hands for centuries. People managed useful trees, cultivated garden plots, modified wetlands, and created mosaics of settlement and agriculture. When populations declined or moved, the forest that returned was not just nature reclaiming a blank space. It was growing through an old human landscape over terraces, house platforms, reservoirs, paths, and fields. The jungle did not erase civilization instantly. It covered its traces slowly, root by root. Royal legitimacy becomes increasingly vulnerable in this setting. A Maya king is not only an administrator, he is a performer of sacred power, a keeper of dynastic memory, a war leader, and a public figure whose authority must be renewed through ritual and display. Monuments are part of that renewal. To carve a stela is to place a ruler's body name ancestry and acts into cosmic time. When monuments cease, something profound has changed. The king may no longer command the labour to quarry, carve, transport, and dedicate stone. He may no longer possess the authority to make public time revolve around his dynasty, or the court itself may have dispersed. The silence of monuments is not silence of the people, but silence of a political voice. This silence spreads unevenly across the southern lowlands. Some centres show signs of violent destruction or rapid decline. Others fade more gradually. Elite buildings may be abandoned while common households continue for a time. In some places, people may deliberately terminate or alter sacred spaces, suggesting ritual responses to endings, rather than simple flight. In others, occupation continues at reduced scale. The evidence remains incomplete, and every site has its own history. But the broader pattern is clear. The classic political order loses its ability to reproduce itself across much of the region. What happens to ordinary people during this process is harder to see but essential. They are the ones deciding whether to stay near a failing court shift to smaller settlements, follow kin networks, seek more reliable water, attach themselves to another polity, or continue farming in a changed landscape. Their decisions may not appear in carved inscriptions, but they make collapse real. A dynasty can fall in one ceremony or one defeat. A city empties household by household. The end of royal monument building is visible to archaeologists. The private decision to leave a home is mostly invisible, yet repeated thousands of times it transforms the map. The Maya case also reveals how collapse can create survival by decentralization. If the royal court demands tribute labor and participation in wars that no longer protect the population, stepping away from that system may be rational. Smaller communities may be less spectacular but more resilient. They require fewer imported prestige goods, fewer massive ceremonies, fewer demands on farmers, and less exposure to elite warfare. From the viewpoint of kings, this is decline. From the viewpoint of households seeking water, food, and safety, it may be adaptation. Collapse is not always the failure of people. Sometimes it's the refusal of people to keep supporting a failing structure, and yet loss is real. The decline of classic Maya cities means the weakening of artistic traditions, courtly knowledge, scribal institutions, and architectural programs that had flourished for centuries. Skills may continue in new forms, but the dense royal world that supported certain kinds of writing art and historical memory changes dramatically. The broken stelae and abandoned plazas are not illusions. They mark the end of a brilliant political order. To say the Maya survived is not to deny the trauma. It is to place trauma and continuity together where they belong. The mystery of the Maya collapse endures because it resists simplification. It contains drought, but is not only drought. It contains warfare, but is not only warfare. It contains environmental strain, but also political ambition. It contains elite failure, but also common resilience. It contains abandonment, but not disappearance. It is one of the clearest windows into how civilizations collapse, not as single bodies falling dead, but as living systems reorganizing under unbearable pressure. By the time the forest grows over the plazas, the old royal voices have already faded. Birds call from temple roofs. Roots enter masonry. Rain collects in reservoirs no longer maintained by the same civic order. The stones remain carved with dates that once made kings seem eternal. But time has moved on without them. The people, however, have not vanished into that silence. They have carried language, memory, foodways, ritual, and identity forward. The collapse of the classic Maya courts is therefore not an ending in the absolute sense. It is a warning that even the most sophisticated systems can fail, and a reminder that human survival often begins after the monument stops speaking. That lesson will appear again on a larger imperial stage in a world of roads, legions, taxes, cities, frontiers, plagues, grain ships, and emperors who inherit not a single city-state or regional network, but a vast machine stretched around the Mediterranean. Rome is not ancient collapse in the same form as the Maya or the Bronze Age palaces, yet it reflects many of the same pressures with unusual clarity. Its long breaking point shows how power can endure for centuries, adapt repeatedly, and still reach a moment when the system no longer repairs itself fast enough. Rome does not collapse like a roof giving way in one storm. It bends, repairs itself, hardens, splits, survives in one form while failing in another, and only later becomes the symbol people use when they want collapse to feel grand and final. That is part of its power as a mirror. Rome lasts so long, covers so much territory, and leaves behind so many roads, laws, ruins, coins, write-ins, borders, and memories, that its fall can seem almost impossible, even after it has happened. The empire looks less like a fragile state than a world with stone foundations. Yet the long breaking point of Rome shows the same pattern seen in earlier civilizations. Strength becomes dependence, complexity becomes cost, and crisis becomes fatal when too many systems fail together. At its height, Rome is not merely a city ruling lands. It is an enormous machine of taxation, law, military force citizenship, slavery, trade, agriculture, urban supply, road building, provincial administration, and imperial ideology. Grain moves across the Mediterranean to feed cities. Taxes move from provinces into imperial treasuries. Soldiers stand along frontiers from Britain to the Rhine, the Danube, North Africa, the Near East, and beyond. Merchants travel roads and sea lanes protected imperfectly but often effectively by Roman power. Cities across the empire build baths, forums, temples, amphitheatres, aqueducts, walls, and villas that declare participation in a shared order. The emperor's image appears on coins handled by people who will never see his face. Rome becomes less a place than a system of expectation, but every expectation has a cost. The army is the empire's shield, but it is also its greatest expense. Roads allow legions to move, but they must be maintained. Cities display imperial prosperity, but they require food, water, sanitation, and money. Frontiers defend the empire, but they also define endless zones of pressure. The tax system supports administration and war, but if it becomes too heavy, it damages the producers it depends upon. The empire's greatness lies in coordination across distance. Its weakness lies in needing that coordination to continue under conditions no emperor can fully control. Rome's western collapse in the 5th century CE did not come from one cause, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. Ancient writers blamed moral decline, bad emperors, barbarians, divine anger, luxury, cowardice, Christianity, or fate, depending on their viewpoint. Modern scholars debate fiscal strain, political instability, military transformation, climate shifts, disease, migration, economic regionalization, elite competition, and the changing structure of imperial authority. Each explanation catches part of the truth. None is enough alone. Rome is too large to fall for one reason. The empire has always faced crises. In the 3rd century, CE Rome nearly tears itself apart through civil wars, usurpations, frontier invasions, plague inflation, and administrative breakdown. Emperors rise and fall with alarming speed. Armies make and unmake rulers. Provinces temporarily break away. Cities fortify themselves. Coinage loses stability. The empire survives, but survival requires transformation. Later emperors reorganized administration, taxation, military structures, imperial courts, and provincial divisions. The empire becomes more openly bureaucratic, more militarized, and in some ways more rigid. Survival after crisis makes Rome stronger in certain respects, but also heavier. The repaired machine is not the same as the old one. It runs, but it requires more fuel. This is a pattern seen in many civilizations. A system survives one crisis by adding complexity, more officials, more taxes, more military layers, more regulations, more defensive walls, more emergency measures. These adaptations can work. They can buy centuries, but they also increase the burden on society. The late Roman state asks more from its population because it must defend more threatened frontiers, pay more troops, manage more unstable politics, and compensate for economic strain. To the imperial centre, these demands are necessary. To local communities, they may feel like extraction without adequate protection. The bargain begins to fray. Climate and disease add pressure to this already demanding structure. The Roman world experiences significant epidemics, including the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, and later outbreaks that seem to have affected population, military manpower, and economic life. The evidence remains debated in scale and interpretation, but major disease events likely weakened parts of the empire at critical moments. Climate variability also matters not as a simple cause, but as a background force affecting harvests, migrations, frontier ecology and resilience. A poor harvest in one region can be managed by a strong empire with secure transport. Repeated instability across multiple regions is harder. Rome's advantage is its connectivity. Its danger is also connectivity. The city of Rome itself depends heavily on imported grain, especially from North Africa and other Mediterranean sources. This is a remarkable achievement of logistics, but also a vulnerability. The capital's population cannot be fed only by nearby fields. Grain ships, ports, political control of producing regions, and secure sea routes all matter. When those routes are disrupted, the symbolic heart of the empire feels the weakness of distant provinces. Later, when the Vandals establish control in North Africa, the Western Empire loses one of its crucial fiscal and grain-producing bases. This is not just a territorial loss. It is the removal of a major artery. The frontiers tell another part of the story. Rome's borders are not solid walls separating civilization from emptiness. They are zones of trade, recruitment, diplomacy, settlement, raiding, and cultural exchange. Peoples beyond the empire are shaped by contact with Rome just as Rome is shaped by them. Some serve as soldiers, some receive subsidies, some trade goods, some flee stronger enemies, some attack. The so-called barbarian world is not static. It changes over centuries, forming larger confederations, new leadership structures and military capacities, partly in response to Rome itself. The empire helps create the frontier powers it later fears. When groups such as Goths, Vandals, Franks, Alans, Huns and others appear in Roman history, they are not simple forces of destruction outside civilization. They are communities and coalitions moving through a world of pressure, opportunity, hunger, violence, diplomacy, and survival. The Huns in particular contribute to instability by pushing other groups toward Roman borders. The movement of Goths into the empire in the late 4th century becomes a critical moment. They seek refuge, settlement, and survival, but Roman mismanagement, exploitation, and fear help turn a migration crisis into war. The disastrous Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378 CE reveals that the imperial military system is vulnerable in ways old confidence had hidden. Yet even after Adrianople, Rome does not simply fall, it continues. It negotiates, recruits, fights, pays, settles, and adapts. This persistence is important because collapse is not inevitable after one disaster. The Western Empire's final weakening comes through repeated shocks and the inability to convert recovery into durable stability. Civil wars drain resources. Usurpers compete for legitimacy. Generals of non-Roman origin gain enormous influence within Roman politics. Provinces are lost or become unreliable. Tax bases shrink. Armies depend increasingly on federate groups whose loyalties are negotiated rather than assumed. Imperial authority remains prestigious, but prestige alone cannot collect taxes or command soldiers everywhere. Rome's internal politics are especially damaging. The empire often spends precious strength fighting itself. Rival emperors court factions, military strongmen, and regional ambitions fracture the unity needed for defense. A state under external pressure can survive if its leadership is coherent and its resources mobilized efficiently. A state under external pressure while its elites compete for control is far more vulnerable. This echoes earlier collapses from Bronze Age palaces to Maya courts. Elite competition turns stress into breakdown. The people at the top may understand the danger and still pursue advantage because each faction fears losing power more immediately than it fears the slow death of the system. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric and the Goths becomes one of the most famous moments in the story, but its symbolic force exceeds its immediate strategic meaning. Rome is no longer the sole administrative centre of the empire, yet the city remains sacred in political memory. For centuries it has stood as the eternal city, the name around which empire imagines itself. Its sack shocks the Roman world because it breaks an expectation. The walls are breached not only in stone but in imagination. If Rome can be entered by enemies, what else believed permanent may be temporary. Still, even this is not the end. The Western Empire continues for decades. Collapse does not always respect the dramatic moments later history chooses. The final deposition of the Western Emperor in 476 CE is often treated as the fall of Rome, but that date is more convenient than complete. By then, much imperial authority in the West has already been hollowed out. Germanic kingdoms control former imperial territories. The Eastern Roman Empire continues wealthy and powerful, centered on Constantinople. Roman law, Christianity, Latin language, land-holding patterns, urban institutions and administrative habits survive in altered forms. The world changes profoundly, but it is not an absolute disappearance. The Western imperial office fades, Roman civilization transforms. This distinction is essential. Rome's fall is not the end of Roman influence and not the death of everyone living under Roman rule. It is the collapse of a Western imperial political structure that can no longer sustain its army tax system, territorial control and authority. Many people continue to farm the same land, worship in the same churches, speak forms of Latin, use Roman roads, and live under elites who still value Roman titles and prestige. For some, life becomes more dangerous and poorer. For others, especially certain local elites, the transition may be negotiated. Collapse is uneven. It is catastrophe in some places, adjustment in others, and only later a single grand story. One lesser-known aspect of Rome's collapse is how much continuity depends on local resilience. Cities shrink, but do not all vanish. Bishops sometimes become key figures in urban leadership. Landowners adapt to new rulers. Soldiers become settled communities. Former imperial tax structures influence successor kingdoms. The Eastern Empire preserves Roman imperial identity for centuries. The idea of Rome becomes so powerful that later kings and emperors repeatedly claim its inheritance. Even after the political structure breaks, the memory of Rome remains a tool of power. This is collapse as transformation, not erasure. Rome's long breaking point therefore gathers many of the earlier themes into one vast example. Environmental stress matters, but only through economy and politics. Disease matters, but only as it weakens labour armies and confidence. Migration matters, but not as a simple invasion story. Overextension matters, but not merely because the empire is large. It matters because obligations outrun resources. Inequality matters because tax burdens and elite privilege affect loyalty. Belief matters because imperial legitimacy must seem real. Military pressure matters because frontiers test every internal weakness. The fall of Rome is not one door closing, it is many locks failing over time. The ruins of the Roman world can make the empire seem like a dead giant. Aqueducts cut across valleys, roads run straight through fields, amphitheatres stand open to the sky, fort walls crumble along former frontiers. But these remains also show how much of Rome was built to last beyond the conditions that made it useful. A road can survive after the tax collectors vanish. A bathhouse can stand after the water system fails. A law code can influence people who no longer obey an emperor in Rome. Stone outlives administration. Memory outlives power. And this is the great lesson Rome shares with older civilizations. Collapse is rarely the destruction of all life. It is the failure of a system to keep organizing life at the scale it once did. The empire does not vanish in a flash. It becomes local, fragmented, negotiated, inherited, imitated, and remembered. The old centre loses its command, but people continue beneath the broken arches in smaller worlds, made from the materials of the larger one. From Akkad to the Maya, from Bronze Age palaces to Rome, the pattern is now clearer. Civilizations fall, but people remain. They carry seeds, tools, stories, rituals, languages, names, and habits into the world after collapse. The palace burns, the emperor falls, the monument stops speaking, but households keep searching for food, water, safety, and meaning. The next part of the story belongs not to the rulers who fail, but to the survivors who walk away from the ruins and make life possible again. Collapse is easiest to see from above. A city shrinks on a map. A palace burns. A writing system disappears. A royal line ends. Monument dates stop. Trade goods vanish from layers where they once appeared regularly. Archaeologists mark a transition. Historians name a period, and later imaginations call it an end. But no one lives from above. People live inside rooms, fields, courtyards, roads, hillsides, boats, kitchens, graves, and decisions made under pressure. For them, collapse is not a date. It is a sequence of mornings in which the old routines become less reliable. It is the slow realization that staying may be more dangerous than leaving, that obedience may no longer bring protection, that the palace may not reopen the granary, that the road to the next town may no longer be safe, that the old centre has become only a place on the horizon. This is why collapse is not disappearance. It is movement, adaptation, simplification, grief, and reorganization. The people who survive a collapsing civilization do not step outside history. They become the carriers of history in less visible forms. They take tools from abandoned houses, seeds from storage jars, family memories from old courtyards, ritual habits from temples that no longer function, and practical knowledge from landscapes that have changed but not become meaningless. They may leave behind carved monuments, but they carry songs, gestures, recipes, field techniques, burial customs, names of ancestors, fears of certain places, and stories about why the old city failed. Some of these survive for generations. Some vanish within a lifetime. Almost none are preserved as clearly as a king's inscription, but they matter more to human continuity. After a palace falls, life often becomes smaller. That smaller scale can look like decline, and in many ways it is. Fewer luxury goods arrive. Writing may become rare or vanish if the institutions that trained scribes no longer exist. Specialized crafts may lose elite patrons. Long-distance trade may contract. Monumental architecture may stop. Cities may empty into villages, hamlets, farmsteads, hilltop refuges, or mobile communities. Diets may narrow. Security may become more local. People may repair older buildings with poorer materials or build new homes from reused stone. To a later observer, the world appears poorer, rougher, and less ambitious. To those living inside it, the smaller world may also be more survivable. There is dignity in this simplification that collapse narratives often miss. A family leaving a failing city is not evidence of cultural failure. It may be evidence of intelligence. A farmer who stops sending grain to a distant palace and instead stores it for kin is making a rational choice. A craftsperson who adapts elite skills to local markets is preserving knowledge under altered conditions. A village that no longer builds monuments may still maintain fields, marriages, rituals, and memory. The loss of complexity can be painful, but complexity is not the only measure of civilization. Sometimes survival requires letting go of the structures that once defined greatness. The end of Bronze Age palaces in Greece, for example, brings the disappearance of linear B writing and the collapse of centralized palace administration, but not the disappearance of Greek-speaking peoples. Communities continue to reorganize and eventually develop new forms of society that lead into the archaic and classical periods. The world after the palaces is different, less centralized, and less literate for a time, but it is not empty. In the Levant, the breakdown of older systems is followed by new cities, peoples, kingdoms, maritime networks, and cultural formations. The early Iron Age is not merely the ashes of the Bronze Age. It is a laboratory of new identities. The Maya case makes the point even more forcefully. When many classic Maya royal courts decline, Maya people do not vanish. They move, adapt, and continue in different regions and forms. Some northern centers rise while southern centers lose power. Communities preserve language, agriculture, ritual, and identity beyond the collapse of particular dynasties. The old royal inscriptions become silent in many places, but human life continues around and beyond them. Modern Maya communities are not remnants of a vanished people. They are descendants of survivors, innovators, and historical actors whose continuity exposes the falsehood of the old disappearance myth. In Egypt, periods of fragmentation after strong centralized kingdoms are often described as intermediate, as though they are merely gaps between grander ages. Yet for those living through them, they are full historical worlds. Regional centers grow in importance. Local elites take on responsibilities once claimed by the central court. Artistic styles change. Burial practices shift. Political authority becomes more distributed. Later reunification may present the fragmented period as chaos because new rulers gain legitimacy by claiming to restore order. But beneath the rhetoric, people have continued to farm, worship, trade, marry, inherit, and negotiate power. The state changes shape. Society does not simply cease. Rome too becomes local after imperial authority weakens in the West. Cities shrink, but bishops, landowners, military leaders, and new kings assume roles in altered political landscapes. Roman roads remain useful even when imperial administration no longer maintains them as before. Latin evolves into new languages. Roman law influences successor kingdoms. Christianity provides institutions and networks that outlast the Western imperial state. Some areas suffer dramatic decline in urban life, trade, and security. Others transform more gradually. The empire's collapse is real, but so is the survival of Roman habits, names, faith, and prestige. The afterlife of Rome is one of the clearest examples of how collapse can produce inheritance rather than oblivion. Survivors also reuse ruins. This is one of the most intimate forms of continuity. Stones from a palace become walls of a farmhouse. Columns become supports in new buildings. Tombs are reopened, robbed, honored, feared, or lived near. Temples become churches, shrines, quarries, shelters, or landmarks. Old roads guide new paths. Broken pottery is ground into temper for new clay. Bronze objects are melted down. Bricks are taken from abandoned structures and built into something humbler. To modern eyes, reuse can seem like desecration. To survivors, it is practicality. The past is not always preserved because people are too busy living from it. Memory transforms as well. A fallen city may become a place of ghosts, gods, ancestors, demons, treasure, or warning. Later communities may tell stories about giants who built the walls, sinful kings who angered heaven, golden ages destroyed by pride, or ancient peoples who disappeared in one night. Such stories are not reliable as literal history, but they reveal how ruins work on the human mind. A ruin demands explanation. If the true causes are too complex, memory simplifies them into morality, myth, or wonder. The archaeological record preserves material change, folklore preserves emotional response. There is a lesser-known kind of survival in administrative habits. Even when states collapse, practices learned under them can persist. People continue using weights, measures land divisions, legal formulas, religious calendars, craft standards and settlement patterns inherited from earlier systems. A new ruler may adopt the titles of the old. A local elite may imitate the court that once dominated them. A community may keep using a road system whose political meaning has changed. Collapse breaks central control, but it does not erase learned ways of organizing life. Institutions die unevenly. Some vanish quickly. Others sink into custom. The survivors of collapse face a difficult balance between remembering and forgetting. Too much memory can bind people to a dead system. Too much forgetting can destroy useful knowledge. A community must decide often without stating it openly what to carry forward. Do they preserve the old rituals or turn to new ones? Do they rebuild the city or move to smaller settlements? Do they maintain fields near failing canals or seek new land? Do they teach the old script when no palace pays scribes? Do they honor fallen kings or blame them? These decisions shape the future more than the final battle or last inscription. Children born after collapse may not experience it as collapse at all. They inherit the aftermath as normal life. A road overgrown with grass is simply the path to pasture. A ruined temple is a place to avoid at night or a source of stone. A story about the old king is something elders tell when fires burn low. The scale of the previous civilization may be unimaginable to them, even if they live beside its remains. This generational shift is one reason collapse can seem so complete. The people survive, but the memory of how the larger system worked fades quickly once daily life no longer requires it. Yet sometimes the memory does not fade. Sometimes it becomes a seed. Later societies revive old capitals, claim descent from ancient rulers, rebuild temples, copy scripts, imitate monuments, or use ruins as proof of legitimacy. The past becomes political again. A collapsed civilization can continue shaping ambition long after its institutions have failed. The ruins teach later rulers what grandeur looks like. They warn them perhaps less successfully what grandeur costs. What collapse strips away is often the illusion of inevitability. The people who live after it know in ways their ancestors may not have known that great centres can fall. They may become more cautious, more local, more suspicious of distant authority, or more willing to follow new powers that promise security. They may develop cultural memories of famine, migration, betrayal, or divine judgment. These memories influence future choices even when details blur. The aftermath of collapse is therefore not empty time. It is a period when societies digest trauma and turn it into new forms. The archaeological record tends to favour the lost elites because they built in durable materials and inscribed their names. Survivors are harder to see. They appear in modest houses, reused objects, changed diets, scattered settlements, smaller cemeteries, altered pottery styles, and the absence of things once common. Their lives may look poor compared with the shining age before them, but they are the reason history continues. Every civilization that collapses leaves behind two stories: the story of the system that failed and the story of the people who found a way to live without it. This second story is quieter, but it is often more important. It prevents collapse from becoming a fantasy of total destruction. It reminds us that people are not the same as states, that culture is not the same as palaces, and that memory does not require monuments to survive. The end of a civilization's dominant form may be devastating, but it can also release communities from burdens, open space for new identities, and scatter knowledge into unexpected places. Collapse is not rebirth in a simple, comforting sense. It is loss first. But within the loss, human beings keep making choices. In the ruins, that continuity is almost visible if one looks carefully. a doorway blocked and reused, a hearth built against an older wall, a child buried near a collapsed building that once belonged to elites, a field boundary crossing what had been a ceremonial avenue, a humble pot placed where imported luxury vessels once stood. These traces do not announce themselves like royal inscriptions, but they are the pulse after the catastrophe. The old system has fallen silent, yet life continues in a lower voice, and this is where the meaning of ancient collapse changes. It is no longer only a warning about doom, it becomes a warning against confusing civilization with its most impressive surfaces. Palaces fall before households, kings vanish before languages, monuments stop before memory. What matters at the end is not whether a civilization can keep building higher, taxing farther, and commanding louder. What matters is whether its people can adapt when the structures above them fail. The final question is not why ruins exist. The final question is what they still warn us about standing in their long silence beneath the same sky that once watched them rise. Ruins warn quietly, because they do not belong only to the civilizations that made them. They belong to every later society that stands before them and feels the strange double vision of human achievement and human limits. A broken aqueduct is still an act of genius. A buried city is still evidence of organization, skill, patience, and imagination. A deserted temple still carries the memory of people who believed their ceremonies mattered to the order of the world. The warning is not that ancient people failed because they were primitive, foolish, or blind. The warning is sharper than that. They often understood their landscapes deeply governed complex systems, built with astonishing precision, managed trade across great distances, tracked the ski-stored grain, wrote laws, raised armies, and preserved memory. They failed anyway, or rather their systems failed because intelligence does not make a civilization invulnerable. The ruins warn against simple explanations. Every collapsed civilization becomes easier to understand after it is dead, when later observers can arrange causes in neat lines and pretend the ending was obvious. Drought weakened the harvest. Rivers shifted, soil declined, trade broke, enemies arrived, elites overreached, faith faltered, disease spread. The pieces can be named, and naming them gives an illusion of mastery. But for those living through collapse, the pieces did not arrive as a textbook list. They arrived as overlapping emergencies, rumours, sacrifices, shortages, arguments, official decrees, bad omens, price changes, blocked roads, missing relatives, low reservoirs, rising taxes, and decisions that seem temporary. A civilization rarely knows the exact moment when crisis becomes collapse. It only knows that each year requires more effort to keep the old world recognizable. This is one of the deepest warnings left by ancient collapsed societies can normalize deterioration. A canal silts a little more each year. A forest retreats beyond the next ridge. Grain rations shrink, then shrink again. Roads become unsafe, but only in certain districts at first. Officials demand more because the state is desperate, and people accept it because they remember when the state worked. Temples perform rituals that once comforted everyone, and even when comfort fades, the rituals continue because no one knows what else to do. A wall is repaired with poorer materials. A palace records the same quotas as if the old abundance remains. Decline becomes ordinary before it becomes undeniable. The ruins also warn that complexity is not the same as resilience. Complexity can be magnificent. It allows thousands or millions of people to cooperate across distances. It supports specialization, art, engineering, law, literature, astronomy, and monumental memory. But complexity can become brittle when too many essential flows depend on conditions that no longer hold. A palace economy needs grain, scribes, transport-obedient labor elite agreement and legitimacy. A maritime trade network needs ports, ships, diplomatic trust, secure routes and demand. An empire needs tax revenue armies, roads, political loyalty, and a believable centre. If one part fails, another may compensate. If many parts fail together, the system can become too heavy to save. Yet ancient ruins do not warn only of fragility. They also warn against arrogance in judging the past. It is easy to look at abandoned cities and imagine that the people there should have known what was coming. They should have planted differently, taxed, less fought, fewer wars, stored more grain, managed forests, better trusted, different leaders moved sooner, or changed their beliefs. Sometimes this may be true. Human choices mattered enormously. Bad decisions deepened crises. Elites often protected privilege at the expense of survival. Rulers pursued war display and prestige when repair and flexibility were needed. But hindsight is a luxury the living do not possess. Ancient people made choices inside limited knowledge, social pressure, sacred obligation, fear, and immediate need. A hungry household cannot easily plan for centuries. A ruler facing rebellion cannot always act like a patient ecologist. A city dependent on trade cannot simply become self-sufficient because danger is rising. The warning is therefore not moral simplicity but humility. Civilizations are built by people who believe they are solving problems. Irrigation solves hunger until it creates maintenance burdens and salinity. Trade solves scarcity until it creates dependence. Central rule solves disorder until it becomes extraction. Monumental religion creates shared meaning until repeated disaster strains belief. Armies defend borders until they consume the resources needed to maintain society. Urban growth creates culture until the city becomes too large to feed safely. Every solution casts a shadow. Collapse often begins when the shadow grows faster than the institutions can adapt. The ruins warn most clearly about trust. Beneath grain water, armies, temples, and trade lies the fragile belief that the system is worth supporting. People do not have to love their rulers to keep a civilization functioning, but they must believe fear, depend, or hope enough to cooperate. Farmers must plant and deliver. Workers must repair. Soldiers must defend. Scribes must record. Merchants must travel. Priests must serve. Local leaders must remain connected to the centre. When drought, inequality, corruption, military failure, disease, and spiritual disappointment erode, the cooperation collapse moves from possibility to process. A state can command obedience for a time through force, but force is costly and blunt. Trust is cheaper, deeper, and harder to rebuild once lost. This is why many ancient collapses end not with everyone dead, but with people opting out. They leave cities, they support local powers, they hide grain, they abandon official rituals, they stop building monuments, they stop maintaining roads or canals that no longer serve them. They move towards smaller worlds where survival feels more manageable. From the viewpoint of the capital, this is decay. From the viewpoint of ordinary life, it may be the only sane response. Collapse is not always a single dramatic refusal. It can be millions of small withdrawals from a system that no longer keeps its promises. The ruins also warn that survival is not always spectacular. The strongest people after collapse may not be the rulers, warriors, or builders of monuments. They may be the farmers who know multiple crops, the herders who can move the craftspeople, who can adapt to local materials, the communities with strong kin networks, the people who preserve practical memory, the villages that can live with less, and the traditions not wholly dependent on royal courts. History often remembers the centre, but resilience may live at the margins. The palace writes its name in stone. The household survives in habits. Still, it would be too comfortable to turn collapse into a hopeful lesson too quickly. Ancient collapses involved hunger, violence, fear, displacement, enslavement, loss of knowledge, abandoned homes, broken families, and generations born into poorer and more dangerous worlds. The fall of a system can free people from burdens, but it can also remove protections. Smaller life may be more flexible, but it may also be more insecure. Trade contraction can protect local autonomy, but it can also reduce access to medicine, tools, food variety, and opportunity. The end of elite domination may open space for new communities, but it may also invite warlords, raiders, and chronic instability. Collapse is not romantic. It is only survivable because people endure what they should not have had to endure. The ancient record leaves another warning in its silences. The people most affected by collapse are often the least heard. Royal inscriptions boast until they stop. Elite tombs reveal wealth until wealth disappears. Administrative records list grain animals, workers, and goods until the archive burns or the scribes vanish. But the hungry child, the indebted farmer, the widow in a city losing population, the refugee at a border, the labourer pulled from a field to repair a wall, the soldier unpaid at the edge of an empire, these voices rarely speak directly. Collapse is reconstructed from the remains of systems, but it is suffered by bodies. Any explanation that forgets those bodies becomes too clean. So what do ruins still warn us about? They warn that no civilization is separate from the land that feeds it. They warn that water, soil, forests, animals, and climate are not background conditions, but active partners in history. They warn that inequality is not only unjust but dangerous when it severs the interests of rulers from the survival of the ruled. They warn that connected systems can spread both prosperity and failure. They warn that faith in permanence can become a weakness when it prevents adaptation. They warn that leaders may preserve appearances long after foundations weaken. They warn that collapse is often visible at the edges before it is admitted at the centre, but they also warn against despair. The past is full of fallen cities and it is equally full of survivors. Human beings repeatedly rebuild from fragments, not always better, not always wiser, but persistently. After palaces burn, villages continue. After empires fragment, languages evolve. After writing systems vanish, memory finds other vessels. After sacred centres fall, silent rituals move into homes, hills, fields, and new temples. After roads crack, people still walk them. The same human restlessness that builds civilizations also searches for life after their failure. In the end, ancient collapse is not a single story of doom. It is a pattern of imbalance, pressure, denial, adaptation, and memory. Civilizations rise by creating systems larger than any one person, and they fall when those systems can no longer respond to the world they helped create. Their ruins stand as evidence that humans can build beyond imagination, but not beyond consequence. They remind us that the most dangerous moment may not be when disaster first appears, but when a society explains it away because the old order still looks impressive from a distance. The silent cities do not say that collapse is inevitable. They say that permanence must be maintained, humility must be practiced, and complexity must remain flexible enough to serve life, rather than consume it. They say that the measure of a civilization is not only what it builds at its height, but what it protects under strain, what it repairs before it breaks what it asks of the vulnerable, and what it is willing to change before change is forced upon it. Every ancient ruin was once a place where people believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. The stones remain to remind us that this belief is powerful, comforting, and never guaranteed. The wind down after collapse is quieter than the collapse itself. It does not come with the crash of gates, the smoke of palaces, or the panic of roads crowded with people leaving home. It comes later, after the shouting has faded, after the rulers have become names, after the last officials who understood the old records are gone, after grass has entered the courtyards, and birds have learned to nest where guards once stood. Time softens the edges of catastrophe, but it does not erase it. It only changes the scale from human urgency to landscape memory. A ruined city is never only a warning. It is also a kind of archive. It preserves the shape of ambition, the weight of labour, the reach of belief, and the cost of trying to make order last. Every wall was touched by hands. Every road once had a destination. Every empty granary once held the hope that hunger could be postponed. Every temple once gathered people who looked upward and believed the world could still be held together by ritual, duty, and repetition. The silence that remains is not the absence of life, but the afterimage of lives too numerous to recover one by one. And beyond the ruins, life continues with a stubbornness that is almost more mysterious than collapse. Seeds are carried away. Children are born in smaller settlements. Old stories change shape around new fires. A broken road becomes a path. A fallen capital becomes a quarry, a shrine, a warning, a legend, or simply a hill beneath the sun. Civilizations end in the form that made them famous, but people keep moving through the wreckage with baskets, tools, animals, memories, and grief. They do not always rebuild what was lost. Sometimes they build something humbler. Sometimes that is enough. The ancient world is filled with these endings that are not endings. Rivers keep moving, forests return, deserts spread and bloom again in different ages. Languages fade, merge, or survive in altered voices. The names of kings disappear, but the grain they demanded, the roads they ordered, and the fears they could not master remain part of the long human record. What the ruins finally offer is not a simple lesson, but a slower awareness. Every society lives inside limits, and every generation inherits both the achievements and the debts of those before it. So the last image is not a city falling. It is a city long after the fall, when evening light touches the stones and the air grows cool. Nothing moves except wind through dry grass and shadow across the broken steps. The world has not ended. It has only changed beyond the reach of the people who once believed they had secured it. And in that stillness the ruins keep their patient watch. Varied, so the final sequence feels like a premium long-form visual documentary rather than repetitive illustrations. Historical and scientific accuracy rules, match clothing, architecture tools, boats, animals, crops, settlement style and environment to the correct era and region implied by the script. If the topic is prehistoric or ancient, reflect the most mainstream plausible reconstruction. If the evidence is uncertain, choose a grounded and widely accepted visual interpretation. Do not invent unsupported fantasy details. Do not over-stylize faces, buildings or landscapes beyond what fits realistic documentary art. When the topic involves collapse, extinction, drought, flood eruption, migration, isolation, undeciphered writing or environmental change, show those ideas in visually grounded ways. Prompt structure. Write each prompt in exactly one sentence. Do not prepend labels such as prompt 1, prompt 2, or any numbering. Output only the raw prompt sentence for each line. Each line should follow this structure: main scene, key subjects, action or atmosphere setting, environmental details, historically accurate material culture, mood, color accents, cinematic documentary realism, historically grounded, highly detailed, dramatic, natural lighting, atmospheric depth, textured surfaces 16:9 aspect ratio, ultra-high resolution. Style tips. Use strong but believable descriptive language. Include terrain, weather, dust, smoke, water, vegetation, ruins, tools, firelight, stone, wood, clay-woven materials, animal presence, or manuscript details when relevant. Prefer visual specificity over generic beauty words. Avoid camera jargon, accept simple terms like wide view, close view, bird's eye view, or ground level view when truly useful. Do not make every image a giant landscape. Mix distance, scale, and human presence. Do not repeat the same composition, weather, or mood too often. Make the sequence feel immersive, archaeological, mysterious, and suitable for a high-retention YouTube history documentary. Output format list each prompt on its own line. Do not add numbering labels, commentary explanations, scene titles, or blank lines. Output only the prompts one per line. Begin once the placeholders are filled. Script section. The script just written above. Note: only specify the image drawing command, do not write prompt at the beginning of each command. Numbered 1-2. Do not include the word prompt. Part 1. Run continuously from 1 to 50. Part 2 up to 200.